What's up, Verified Fears family? Welcome back to the channel where we explore the stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into something that's going to leave you questioning every late-night drive you've ever taken. We're exploring 11 of the most disturbing true horror stories from America's truck drivers, the people who spend their lives on our highways when the rest of us are asleep. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real accounts shared directly with me by drivers who've experienced things on those lonely stretches of road that most of us will never encounter. These truckers have nothing to gain by sharing these stories. Many risk their reputations and jobs by speaking out. But the weight of these encounters drives them to warn others about what's really out there in the darkness between cities. From phantom voices on CB radios to encounters that defy explanation, these 11 stories will escalate from psychological terror to cosmic horror that will stick with you long after this video ends. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who aren't afraid to stare into the darkness. For my regular viewers, you know what to do. Grab your headphones, turn down the lights, and prepare for a journey through the verified fears that haunt America's highways. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at those 18-wheelers the same way again. Let's begin with our first story, and remember, they only get more disturbing from here. My name is Jackson, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for 15 years. I've hauled everything from produce to heavy machinery across every major interstate in this country, logged over 2 million miles, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me on Interstate 80 through Nebraska 3 winters ago still keeps me awake some nights, and I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. But after what I learned later, I think other drivers need to know about this. It was February 2023, and I was running a load of auto parts from Detroit to Sacramento. Standard run for me. I'd done this route probably 50 times over the years. I knew every truck stop, every way station, every decent place to grab a meal between Michigan and California. The weather reports were calling for snow through Nebraska and Wyoming, but nothing I hadn't handled before. My Peterbilt was winterized, I had chains, and I'd left Detroit with extra time built into my delivery schedule. Everything was routine until I hit that stretch of Interstate 80 between Grand Island and North Platte around 2:30 in the morning. The snow had started about an hour earlier, just light flurries that weren't sticking to the pavement yet. I had my CB on Channel 19 like always, listening to the usual chatter between drivers about road conditions, speed traps, and the occasional "Asser" joke to keep everyone awake. That's when I first heard the voice. It came through clear as day, no static, no interference, which was unusual given the weather conditions that were rolling in. Eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 279. You need to start thinking about finding shelter soon. This storm's going to get worse than the weather service is reporting. I checked my position. I was exactly at mile marker 279, running eastbound in a blue Peterbilt 379. But that could have been coincidence. Plenty of Pete drivers on I-80, and the mile marker information gets shared regularly over the CB. I keyed my mic and responded. "Thanks for the heads up, driver. This is the Blue Pete. You got a handle?" "Call me Guardian, Blue Pete. And Jackson, you're going to want to start looking for a place to shut down in the next 20 miles. Trust me on this one." The way he said my name made my blood go cold. I'd never given my real name over the CB. Truckers use handles for a reason. Most of the guys I run with regularly know me as Michigan Mike because of where I'm based out of. I'd never mentioned my actual name on the radio during this trip. Hell, I couldn't remember the last time I'd used my real name on CB Channel 19. I grabbed my mic again, more cautious this time. Guardian, I don't recall mentioning my name. How'd you come by that information? Jackson, you've got bigger concerns right now. Check your mirrors. That white sedan that's been following you since Grand Island is about to make a move. And with this weather moving in, you don't want to be dealing with road rage tonight. I looked in my side mirrors, and sure enough, there was a white sedan about a quarter-mile back that I'd noticed on and off for the past hour. I'd figured it was just someone trying to draft behind my trailer to save on gas. Happens all the time. But as I watched, the car started accelerating, moving into the left lane like it was going to pass, then suddenly swerved back behind me at the last second. The maneuver was aggressive, erratic, and with snow starting to accumulate on the road's surface, it was dangerous as hell. Guardian, how did you know about that car? Because I'm watching out for you, Jackson. Like I watched out for your father when he was running these same routes back in the 80s. Frank was a good man. Taught you everything about being safe on the road. Shame about that heart attack in 2019. I nearly lost control of my truck. My father's name was Frank, and yes, he'd been a trucker. He'd taught me everything I knew about driving, about respecting the road and the responsibility that comes with moving 80,000 pounds of truck and cargo down the highway. And he had died of a massive heart attack in March of 2019. But there was no way some random voice on the CB could know these details about my life. I'd never discussed my father over the radio, never mentioned my family history to other drivers I didn't know personally. The snow was getting heavier now, and I could feel my trailer starting to get a little loose on the increasingly slick pavement. The white sedan was still behind me, occasionally flashing its high beams for no apparent reason. My hands were shaking as I reached for the CB mic. Guardian, I don't know who you are or how you know these things about me, but I need you to explain what's going on here. What's going on, Jackson, is that you need to take exit 257 in about 15 miles. There's a truck stop there, Miller's Travel Plaza. It's not one of the big chains, but they've got parking, food, and most importantly, they've got security cameras and good lighting. That sedan isn't going to follow you into a well-lit truck stop with witnesses around. I knew Miller's Travel Plaza. It was one of those old-school independent truck stops that had been around since the 70s, family-owned, decent food, and a reputation for being trucker-friendly. But more importantly, Guardian was right about the security and lighting. If this sedan was planning something, a busy truck stop would be the safest place for me to stop. Guardian, how do you know so much about my route, about that car, about my family? Because someone needs to watch out for drivers like you, Jackson. Drivers who are respectful, who follow the rules, who treat other people on the road with courtesy. Your father was the same way. Remember what he used to tell you about the 3 most important things in trucking? I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My father had always told me there were 3 cardinal rules for truck drivers. Arrive alive, protect your cargo, and help other drivers when you can. It was his personal philosophy, something he drummed into me during my first years on the road. But again, this was information that no strangers should have had access to. The weather was deteriorating rapidly now. What had started as light snow was turning into a full-scale blizzard, with wind gusts that were making it hard to keep my truck in my lane. The white sedan was still behind me, but it was struggling even more than I was with the conditions. I could see it fishtailing occasionally as the driver fought to maintain control. Guardian, I'm going to take that exit you mentioned. But I need to know, who are you? How do you know so much about me and my family? Take the exit, Jackson. Get yourself parked safely, get some hot coffee, and call your wife, Sarah. She's been worried about this storm, and she's been checking the weather reports every hour since you left Detroit. Tell her you're safe. My wife's name is Sarah, and she does exactly what Guardian described. Tracks weather along my routes and worries when conditions get bad. But once again, this was personal information that no CB radio operator should have known. I was starting to feel genuinely frightened, not just confused. I took exit 257 and pulled into Miller's Travel Plaza. The lot was about half full, which was normal for a storm night. Drivers getting off the road before conditions got too dangerous. I found a parking spot under one of the bright security lights and shut down my engine. As I was gathering my things to go inside, I noticed the white sedan had followed me into the truck stop. It parked near the fuel islands, and I could see the driver just sitting there, not getting out, not fueling up, just watching. I grabbed my CB mic one more time before heading inside. Guardian, I'm parked safe at Miller's. That sedan followed me in, but you're right about the lighting and security. I can't thank you enough for the guidance tonight. There was a long pause, longer than normal for CB communication. Then Guardian's voice came back, but this time it sounded different somehow. Distant, like it was coming from very far away. You're welcome, Jackson. Stay inside until morning. That storm's going to be worse than anyone predicted. And that sedan is going to leave in about 10 minutes when the driver realizes this isn't going to be as easy as he thought. Drive safe, son. Your father would be proud of how you handled tonight. I sat in my truck for another few minutes, watching the sedan. Just like Guardian predicted, after about 10 minutes, the car pulled away from the fuel islands and left the truck stop, heading back toward the interstate. I never saw it again. Inside Miller's Travel Plaza, I called Sarah like Guardian had suggested. She was awake, worried about the storm, and relieved to hear I was safe. I spent the night in my sleeper berth, and by morning, the storm had passed. When I checked with the Nebraska State Patrol the next day, they told me they'd had multiple reports of aggressive drivers and several weather-related accidents along that stretch of Interstate 80 during the storm. But here's the part that still haunts me. About a week after I got home, I was curious enough about Guardian to do some research. I reached out to some of the old-timers in the trucking community, drivers who'd been on the road since the 80s, to ask if anyone remembered someone with that handle. What I found out made me question everything that had happened that night. There had been a driver who used the handle Guardian back in the late 80s and early 90s. He was known for helping other truckers, for watching out for drivers who were new to the road or dealing with dangerous situations. His real name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been legendary in the CB community for his knowledge of routes, weather patterns, and his uncanny ability to know when other drivers were in trouble. Marcus Webb had died in January of 1994 in a truck accident on Interstate 80 in Nebraska, just 40 miles east of where I'd encountered Guardian's voice. He'd been trying to help another driver during a blizzard when his truck hit black ice and rolled. The official report said he'd been using his CB radio right up until the moment of impact, trying to guide other drivers to safety. I've driven that stretch of Interstate 80 dozens of times since that night. And I've never heard Guardian's voice again. I've asked other drivers if they've ever encountered anything similar, and most just look at me like I'm crazy. But a few of the older drivers, the ones who remember Marcus Webb, they just nod and tell me I was lucky to have someone watching out for me that night. I still don't have a rational explanation for what happened. I can't prove that the voice I heard was supernatural, And I can't prove it wasn't just an elaborate prank by someone who'd done extensive research into my personal life. But what I do know is that Guardian's guidance got me through one of the most dangerous situations I've ever faced on the road. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Sometimes, late at night when I'm running through Nebraska, I'll key my mic on channel 19 and say, "Thank you, Guardian." I never get a response. But somewhere out there in the static and the darkness, I like to think Marcus Webb is still watching out for drivers who need help. And that thought makes those lonely miles a little less frightening, even when the snow starts to fall. My name is Natalia, and I've been driving trucks for 8 years. When I started, I was one of maybe 3 female drivers at my company. And I learned real quick that being a woman in this industry means you've got to be twice as careful and 3 times as smart as everyone else. I've got protocols for everything: where I stop, when I stop, who I talk to, and especially who I let near my truck. What happened to me over the course of 3 trips on Route 395 through the California desert taught me that sometimes all the caution in the world isn't enough when someone is determined to make you their target. I run a dedicated route between Los Angeles and Reno, hauling electronics and computer components for a tech company. It's good, steady work, and I know the route like the back of my hand. Route 395 through the Mojave Desert isn't the most traveled highway, but it's reliable, and I can make the run in about 7 hours with proper stops. I've got my timing down to a science. I know exactly where I'll be at any given time, which truck stops have the cleanest facilities, and which areas to avoid after dark. The first time I saw him was on a Tuesday evening in September. I was about 3 hours into my northbound run, somewhere between Kramer Junction and Inyokern, when I spotted the hitchhiker on the side of the road. He was standing next to one of those old mile marker posts, holding a cardboard sign that I couldn't read from my cab. White male, maybe mid-30s, wearing a faded denim jacket and jeans. Nothing particularly unusual about him, except that he was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was 15 miles in either direction. I don't pick up hitchhikers, period. It's one of my absolute rules, and it's served me well over the years. But as I passed him, I glanced at my dashboard clock, and something struck me as odd. It was exactly 7:47 p.m. Not 7:46 or 7:48, but precisely 7:47. I remember thinking it was weird that I'd noticed the time so specifically, but I shrugged it off and kept driving. 2 weeks later, I was making the same run on the same day of the week. Tuesday evening, northbound to Reno. Same cargo, same departure time from LA. I was listening to a podcast about true crime, probably not the best choice for a solo female driver at night, when I saw him again. Same hitchhiker, same location, same mile marker post, same denim jacket, same cardboard sign I couldn't read. And when I looked at my clock as I passed him, it was exactly 7:47 p.m. again. This time, I paid more attention. I could see him more clearly in my side mirrors as I passed, and he turned to watch my truck go by. There was something about the way he moved, the way he tracked my vehicle with his eyes, that made me uncomfortable. It felt less like a desperate hitchhiker hoping for a ride and more like someone taking notes, studying my patterns. I called my dispatcher when I got to Reno, asked if any other drivers had reported seeing hitchhikers on that stretch of 395. He said no, but reminded me about company policy regarding picking up strangers. I told him I wasn't planning on it, but the conversation left me feeling uneasy. When I made my return trip to LA the next day, I took a different route through Bakersfield, adding an hour to my drive, but avoiding that stretch of desert entirely. The third time changed everything. It was 4 weeks after the second encounter, same Tuesday evening schedule, and I'd convinced myself that taking the longer route every trip was just paranoia. Route 395 was faster, more fuel efficient, and I knew it better than any other road in California. So I went back to my regular route, telling myself that the hitchhiker was probably just someone who'd been stranded temporarily and had long since found other transportation. I was wrong. He was there again. Same spot, same time. But this time, as I approached his location, he stepped closer to the edge of the road and held up his cardboard sign so I could read it. In large block letters, it said, Natalia. My name. My actual name. Not my CB handle, not my company driver number, but my real first name that's on my CDL and nowhere else that a random stranger should have access to. I floored the accelerator, my heart pounding as I blew past him going 20 miles over the speed limit. In my mirror, I could see him watching my truck disappear down the highway, and I swear I could see him smiling. When I checked my clock, it was 7:47 p.m. exactly, just like the previous encounters. I pulled into the first truck stop I could find, a TA travel center about 30 miles up the road, and sat in my cab trying to process what had just happened. Someone had figured out my schedule, my route, and somehow learned my name. This wasn't a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. This was deliberate, planned, and targeted specifically at me. I called my dispatcher immediately, explained the situation, and requested permission to vary my schedule and route for the next several trips. He agreed, but he also suggested I file a report with the California Highway Patrol. I did, though I could tell from the officer's reaction that he thought I was probably overreacting to what might have been a prank or misunderstanding. For the next month, I changed everything. Different departure times, different routes, different days of the week when possible. I started carrying pepper spray in my pocket and a baseball bat in my cab. I parked only at well-lit truck stops with security cameras and never got out of my truck alone after dark. I thought I'd solve the problem through unpredictability. But predators are often more patient and more resourceful than their victims realize. 6 weeks after the sign incident, I was running a makeup trip on a Thursday morning, completely different from my usual Tuesday evening schedule. I was taking Interstate 5 north through the Central Valley, a route I'd never used for this particular run, when I saw a figure on an overpass about 50 miles north of Bakersfield. It was him. Same denim jacket, same build, same posture. He was standing on the overpass, looking down at the traffic, and as I passed underneath, he dropped something that hit my windshield. It was a folded piece of paper that got caught under my windshield wiper. The impact startled me so much that I swerved slightly into the shoulder before regaining control. I pulled over at the next rest area and retrieved the paper with shaking hands. Written in the same block letters as the cardboard sign was a message. Thursday morning makeup run. I-5 northbound. You can't hide from your schedule, Natalia. He knew. Somehow, he knew about a trip that had been assigned to me less than 12 hours earlier, a route I'd never taken before, on a day and time completely different from my normal pattern. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lucky spotting me on the highway. This was someone who had access to information about my work schedule, my routes, and my personal details. I called 911 from the rest area and demanded to speak with a detective. When the state police arrived, I showed them the note and explained the pattern of encounters. The officer, Detective Rodriguez, took me seriously in a way that previous law enforcement contacts hadn't. He photographed the note, took detailed statements, and promised to check surveillance footage from truck stops along my regular routes. What Detective Rodriguez found was terrifying. Security camera footage from 3 different truck stops showed the same individual, my hitchhiker, hanging around the parking areas during my regular stops. In several videos, he could be seen photographing license plates, including mine. In one particularly disturbing clip from a TA travel center, he was captured following me from my truck to the restaurant, maintaining a distance, but clearly tracking my movements. But the most chilling discovery came when Detective Rodriguez ran the man's description through law enforcement databases. Based on the security footage, they were able to identify him as David Kellerman, a 34-year-old with a history of stalking convictions involving female truck drivers in 3 different states. His MO was always the same. He would identify a female driver with a regular route, study her patterns for weeks or months, then gradually escalate his contact until the victim either changed jobs or moved to a different state. According to the detective, Kellerman had been doing this for over 5 years. He would get jobs at truck stops, shipping companies, or logistics firms. Any position that gave him access to driver schedules, route information, and personal details. He'd been fired from at least 6 different companies for inappropriate behavior. But he always managed to find new employment in the industry before his background caught up with him. The most disturbing part was how sophisticated his surveillance had become. Detective Rodriguez explained that Kellerman had been using multiple vehicles to follow his targets, switching between a motorcycle, a pickup truck, and at least 2 different sedans to avoid detection. He'd also been using CB radios to monitor driver communications and had somehow gained access to electronic logging device data that showed exactly when and where his targets would be at any given time. When they finally arrested Kellerman 3 days later at a truck stop in Nevada, they found a storage unit filled with surveillance equipment, photographs of female truck drivers, detailed schedules and route maps, and personal information about dozens of women in the industry. My file was one of the thickest, containing photos of me, my truck, my home address, information about my family, and detailed logs of my movements going back almost 6 months. Detective Rodriguez told me that I was lucky. 2 other drivers who had been targeted by Kellerman hadn't been as cautious as I was. One had been sexually assaulted at a rest area, and another had been forced off the road and robbed. Both incidents had occurred after months of stalking similar to what I'd experienced. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been using a network of accomplices, other truck stop employees, dispatchers, and even some drivers, to gather information about female truckers. Some of these people didn't realize they were helping a predator. They thought they were just sharing harmless gossip or helping someone who claimed to be trying to reconnect with an old friend. But others knew exactly what they were participating in and were motivated by money or their own predatory instincts. Kellerman was eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for stalking, harassment, and assault charges across multiple states. But the experience changed my relationship with trucking forever. I still drive, but I work for a different company now, one with better security protocols and more awareness of the unique dangers female drivers face. I've never returned to Route 395, and I've never run the LA to Reno route again. The thing that haunts me most isn't the fear I felt during those encounters. It's the realization of how vulnerable I was without even knowing it. For months, someone had been studying my life, learning my patterns, and planning God knows what, while I went about my daily routine completely oblivious to the danger. Every time I stopped for fuel, every time I ate at a truck stop restaurant, every time I took a mandatory rest break, I was being watched and documented by someone who saw me not as a professional driver, just trying to do my job, but as a potential victim. I share this story not to scare other female drivers out of the industry, but to emphasize how important it is to trust your instincts and vary your routines. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If you see the same person or vehicle multiple times in different locations, report it. And always remember that the predators in this world are often more organized, more patient, and more resourceful than we want to believe. The highway can be a dangerous place for anyone. But as women in this industry, we face additional risks that most people never think about. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never hesitate to ask for help when something doesn't feel right. Your life might depend on it. My name is Tommy, and my driving partner is Eddie. We've been running team for 12 years now, and I can tell you that in over 1 million miles together, we've seen everything the road has to throw at drivers. We've driven through hurricanes, blizzards, ice storms, and desert heat that would cook an egg on your dashboard. We've dealt with every kind of mechanical breakdown, road construction nightmare, and traffic jam imaginable. But what happened to us on I-35 through Oklahoma 2 years ago was something that shouldn't have been possible. Something that still makes us question what we think we know about time, space, and the nature of reality itself. Eddie and I run a dedicated route hauling automotive parts from Michigan down to Texas and back. It's steady work, good money, and we've got our system down to a science. Eddie drives the day shift, I take the nights, and we can make the run from Detroit to Dallas in about 18 hours with proper fuel and rest stops. We know every mile of I-35 from the Minnesota border down to the Rio Grande. Every truck stop, every way station, every construction zone that might slow us down. We've driven this route so many times that we could probably do it blindfolded. It was a Tuesday night in October, and I'd taken over driving duties at a truck stop just north of Oklahoma City around 10 p.m. Eddie was crashed out in the sleeper berth, and I was settling in for my 8-hour shift behind the wheel. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time running south on Interstate 35 through the rolling hills of central Oklahoma. I had classic rock playing on the satellite radio, a thermos of coffee, and about 400 miles to cover before Eddie would take over again at our scheduled driver change in Gainesville, Texas. Everything was completely normal until I passed mile marker 237. It's just south of a little town called Paul's Valley. Nothing special about the location, just another stretch of divided highway cutting through Oklahoma farmland. But as I passed that marker, I noticed something odd. My fuel gauge, which had been showing 3/4 full just a few minutes earlier, was now reading completely full. Not just full, but pegged beyond the full mark, like I'd somehow gained fuel while driving. I figured it was just a gauge malfunction. These newer trucks have so many electronic systems that glitches aren't uncommon, and fuel gauges can be particularly temperamental. I made a mental note to have it checked at our next maintenance stop and kept driving. But then I started noticing other things that didn't make sense. The mile markers seemed to be going backwards. I passed marker 237. Then a few minutes later, I saw marker 236, then 235. But I was definitely driving south. I could tell by the position of the stars and the direction of the occasional town lights I could see in the distance. My GPS was showing that I was making normal progress toward Texas. But the mile markers were telling a different story. I thought maybe I'd gotten confused, maybe I'd missed a turn or gotten on the wrong highway somehow. So I pulled out my atlas. Yeah, I still carry a paper atlas, old habits die hard, and double-checked my position. According to my GPS, I was exactly where I should be on Interstate 35 South, but the mile markers continued to count backwards as I drove. That's when I decided to wake up Eddie. In 12 years of team driving, we've had a rule that either driver can wake the other if something doesn't feel right, no questions asked, no complaints about lost sleep. I reached back and shook Eddie's shoulder until he stirred. Eddie, man, I need you to look at something. I think there's something wrong with either our GPS or the mile markers, and I want a second set of eyes on this. Eddie climbed up into the passenger seat, still groggy but alert enough to help troubleshoot. I explained what I'd been seeing. and he checked our position on both the GPS and his smartphone. Both devices confirmed that we were on Interstate 35 South, making normal progress toward Texas at about 65 miles per hour. Tommy, according to this, we should be passing mile marker 220 in about 10 minutes, Eddie said, studying his phone. If you're seeing backwards mile markers, then something is definitely screwed up with the highway signs. We kept driving, both of us watching for the next mile marker. When it appeared in our headlights, it read 237, the same marker I'd passed about 20 minutes earlier. Eddie and I looked at each other, and I could see the confusion in his eyes that I was feeling. "Okay, that's weird," Eddie said. "But GPS glitches happen. Mile marker signs get replaced wrong sometimes. Let's just keep driving and see what happens at the next marker." 5 minutes later, we passed mile marker 236, then 235, then, impossibly, 237 again. We were stuck in some kind of loop, passing the same 5-mile stretch of highway over and over. But our GPS continued to show normal progress. Our fuel gauge stayed pegged at full, and the clock on our dashboard continued to advance normally. Eddie was fully awake now, and he started taking notes on everything he could observe. Our electronic logging device showed that we were driving at normal speed, covering normal distance, using normal amounts of fuel. But the physical evidence outside our truck, the mile markers, the landscape, even the same farmhouse with a distinctive red barn that we kept passing every 15 minutes, told a completely different story. "Tommy, this is impossible," Eddie said, his voice tight with confusion and growing fear. "We're covering distance according to every piece of technology in this truck, but we're not actually going anywhere. It's like we're stuck in some kind of time loop, but only partially. We decided to try something different. At the next mile marker, 237. And yes, we passed it again. I pulled over to the shoulder and stopped the truck. We got out, looked around, tried to find something that would explain what was happening. The night air was cool, normal for October in Oklahoma. We could hear insects chirping, see stars overhead, even see the lights of what appeared to be Paul's Valley in the distance. Everything seemed completely ordinary, except for the fact that we were apparently trapped in a 5-mile stretch of highway. Back in the truck, we tried calling our dispatcher, but couldn't get a signal on either of our cell phones. The CB radio was picking up normal trucker chatter, but when we tried to break in and ask for our location to be confirmed by other drivers, no one seemed to hear us. It was like we existed in our own bubble, isolated from the rest of the world, but still connected enough to receive radio signals. For the next 2 hours, we continued driving the same 5 miles over and over. We passed the same landmarks, the same mile markers, the same farmhouse with the red barn. Our fuel gauge never moved from full, our odometer kept adding miles, and our ELD kept recording normal driving time. According to our truck's computer systems, we had covered 130 miles in those 2 hours. According to physical reality, we hadn't gone anywhere at all. Eddie started keeping a detailed log of each loop, noting the exact time we passed each mile marker, what we saw, and how long it took to complete each circuit. The loops were perfectly consistent. Exactly 14 minutes and 30 seconds from mile marker 237 back to mile marker 237. Never 14 minutes and 29 seconds. Never 14 minutes and 31 seconds. Always exactly 14:30. "Tommy, I think we need to try something drastic," Eddie said during our 4th hour of looping. "This isn't a mechanical problem or a GPS glitch. This is something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be possible. But maybe if we do something completely different, something unexpected, we can break out of it." We had tried everything we could think of. Stopping, turning around, taking an exit that appeared and disappeared with each loop, even getting out and walking along the shoulder. Nothing changed the pattern. We were trapped in this 5-mile stretch of I-35, and conventional solutions weren't working. That's when Eddie noticed something that chilled us both to the bone. Looking in the passenger side mirror during our next approach to mile marker 237, he could see a truck behind us in the distance. As we got closer to the marker, the truck became more clearly visible. It was a Kenworth, pulling what looked like a refrigerated trailer. "Tommy," Eddie said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That truck behind us. Look at it carefully when we pass the mile marker." As we completed the loop and started the cycle again, the truck behind us became visible once more. Same Kenworth, same reefer trailer, same distance behind us. But this time, Eddie had binoculars, and he was studying the truck more carefully. "Jesus Christ, Tommy. That's us. That's our truck." I looked in my mirror, and he was right. The truck following us through each loop was identical to ours. Same model Freightliner, same company colors, same trailer configuration. But it was impossible for us to be following ourselves unless we were somehow existing in multiple versions simultaneously. As we watched our own truck in the mirror, we could see two figures in the cab, a driver and a passenger, just like us. The driver appeared to be looking ahead at our truck, while the passenger was turned around, looking backward. It was like watching a reflection, but a reflection that was independently moving through the same space we occupied. The realization that we were somehow sharing this loop with another version of ourselves broke something in both of us. We started yelling, honking the horn, flashing our lights, trying to get the attention of the truck behind us. But our other selves seemed unaware of our presence, just as we had been unaware of theirs until Eddie spotted them in the mirror. We drove for another hour with this knowledge, watching our own truck follow us through loop after loop, knowing that somewhere ahead of us there was probably yet another version of ourselves that we were following without realizing it. The implications were terrifying. How many versions of us were trapped in this loop? How long had this been going on? Were there other trucks, other drivers caught in the same impossible cycle? Finally, Eddie made a decision that probably saved our sanity, if not our lives. "Tommy, the next time we approach mile marker 237, I want you to stop the truck right at the marker. Not before it, not after it, but right at it. And I want both of us to get out and touch the mile marker post at exactly the same time." I thought he'd lost his mind, but after 5 hours of impossible loops, conventional logic had already failed us completely. When we reached mile marker 237 again, I stopped the truck so that the marker post was directly beside Eddie's door. We both got out, walked to the post, and placed our hands on it simultaneously. The world lurched. I don't know how else to describe it. It felt like everything around us shifted about 6 inches to the left, like reality itself had been knocked slightly out of alignment and then snapped back into place. When the sensation stopped, we were standing beside mile marker 237. But everything felt different. The air smelled different. The quality of light from our headlights seemed changed, and the oppressive feeling of being trapped that had been growing stronger with each loop was suddenly gone. We got back in the truck, and I started driving south again. 5 minutes later, we passed mile marker 236, then 235, then 234. Normal sequence, normal progression, no more loops. Our fuel gauge dropped to where it should have been based on actual consumption. Our GPS resumed showing accurate positions, and our cell phones picked up signals again. We drove in silence for the next hour, both of us trying to process what had happened. When we reached our scheduled driver change point in Gainesville, Texas, we were exactly on time according to our original schedule, despite having spent over 5 hours trapped in that 5-mile loop. According to our ELD, we had driven the normal distance in the normal amount of time. According to our memories, we had experienced something that should have been impossible. We've never talked about that night with anyone else. Who would believe us? But Eddie and I both keep detailed logbooks now, noting not just the required information about our routes and rest periods, but also any anomalies we observe, any moments when something doesn't feel quite right. We've driven through that stretch of I-35 dozens of times since that night, and it's always been completely normal. But sometimes, just as we approach mile marker 237, one of us will glance in the mirrors, just to make sure there's no freight liner following us through the Oklahoma darkness. Because we learned that night that the highway can trap you in ways that go beyond mechanical breakdowns or bad weather. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing on the road isn't other drivers or equipment failure. It's the possibility that the road itself might not always follow the rules of physics that we take for granted. The scariest part isn't that it happened to us. The scariest part is wondering how many other drivers have been caught in similar loops on highways across the country, and whether some of them ever found their way out. My name is Camden, and I'm what they call an owner-operator. That means I own my truck, I find my own loads, and I'm responsible for every aspect of my business, from fuel costs to insurance to maintenance. It also means I'm naturally suspicious of anyone who wants to poke around my equipment or ask too many questions about my cargo. After 23 years of trucking, 15 of them as an independent, I've learned that most people who approach you at 3 a.m. in a deserted truck stop parking lot don't have your best interests at heart. What happened to me at a truck stop outside Bakersfield, California, taught me that sometimes the people you should trust the least are the ones carrying badges and claiming to represent the government. I was hauling a load of industrial machinery from Portland, Oregon, down to Phoenix, Arizona. Standard freight for me. Heavy equipment that pays well and doesn't require any special handling or time-sensitive delivery. I'd picked up the load on a Friday morning, and by Sunday night, I was making good time through California's Central Valley, planning to deliver first thing Monday morning and be back home in Oregon by Wednesday. The truck stop where this all went down is called Desert Oasis, and it's one of those independent places that's been around since the 70s. Not fancy like the big chain stops, but clean, safe, and trucker-friendly, with reasonable fuel prices and decent food. I'd stopped there dozens of times over the years, usually around midnight or 1 a.m. when I was running this particular route. The parking lot is well lit, they've got security cameras, and the staff knows most of the regular drivers by name. It was about 3:15 a.m. when I pulled in to fuel up and grab a quick meal before pushing on toward Phoenix. The lot was maybe half full, which was normal for a Sunday night. I fueled up, parked in my usual spot near the back of the lot where there's more room for larger trucks, and was walking toward the restaurant when a man approached me from between two parked trailers. He was wearing what looked like an official DOT inspector's uniform. Dark blue shirt with patches and badges, black pants, utility belt with a flashlight, clipboard, and measuring tape. Middle-aged white guy, maybe 55, with graying hair and the kind of authoritative demeanor that government officials tend to develop after years on the job. Nothing about his appearance seemed unusual or suspicious. "Evening, driver," he said, showing me an ID badge. "Inspector Williams, Department of Transportation. I'm conducting random safety inspections tonight. Mind if I take a look at your equipment and paperwork?" Now, DOT inspections are a normal part of trucking life. They can happen anywhere, anytime, and refusing one is a good way to get your commercial license suspended. But something about this situation felt off. Random inspections at 3 a.m. in truck stop parking lots aren't unheard of, but they're not common either. Most DOT enforcement happens at way stations, roadside checkpoints, or during business hours at trucking companies. But Inspector Williams had the right uniform, the right badge, and the right attitude. More importantly, he knew the right procedures. He asked for my logbook, my medical certificate, my registration, and insurance papers. He checked my pre-trip inspection report and asked detailed questions about my route, my cargo, and my driving hours. Everything seemed legitimate. "What kind of machinery are you hauling?" he asked, walking around my trailer and checking the tie-downs and safety chains. "Industrial printing equipment," I replied, which was what my bill of lading said. "Heading to Phoenix for a Monday morning delivery." Inspector Williams nodded and made notes on his clipboard. Then he asked to see my cargo manifests and bills of lading, which is standard procedure for a Level 1 inspection. I handed them over, and he studied them carefully under his flashlight. "Camden, according to these documents, you're hauling 3 pieces of printing equipment with a total declared value of $280,000. But I'm seeing some discrepancies in the weight distribution and load securement that I need to check more closely." He walked around my trailer again, this time paying particular attention to the rear doors. "I need to do a visual inspection of the cargo to verify it matches the manifests. Can you open the trailer for me?" This is where things started to feel wrong. Visual cargo inspections are part of DOT authority, but they're usually reserved for situations where there's reasonable suspicion of violations or safety issues. Opening a sealed trailer for a random inspection at 3 a.m. in a truck stop parking lot was unusual. But again, refusing would have caused more problems than cooperating. I opened the trailer doors, and Inspector Williams climbed up into the cargo area with his flashlight. The 3 pieces of printing equipment were exactly where they should be, properly secured and matching the descriptions on my paperwork. But Williams seemed to know more about the cargo than he should have. "This is a Heidelberg Speedmaster XL106, he said, examining the largest piece. 6-color press, probably worth about $150,000 used. The buyer in Phoenix is expanding their commercial printing operation." He moved to the second piece. "And this is a Komori Lithrone GX40, 4-color press, probably around $80,000. Both machines were refurbished in Portland by Pacific Press Services." I felt my blood go cold. None of that information was on my manifests or bills of lading. My paperwork just described the cargo as printing equipment, with model numbers and serial numbers. There was no way a DOT inspector should have known the specific makes and models, the estimated values, or details about the buyer's business plans. That kind of information would only be available to someone who had access to the shipper's internal records or the buyer's purchase orders. "Inspector Williams," I said carefully, "how do you know so much about this specific equipment?" He looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Camden, part of my job is knowing what freight moves through my territory and where it's going. Industrial machinery theft is a major problem in California, and printing equipment is particularly valuable on the black market. That explanation might have made sense if we were at a weigh station or inspection facility, but we were in a truck stop parking lot in the middle of nowhere. And he still hadn't explained how he knew details that weren't in my paperwork." Williams continued his inspection, moving to the 3rd piece of equipment. "This one's interesting," he said. "Ryobi 3404 DI, digital printing press. These are popular with smaller print shops because they're versatile and relatively affordable. The serial number on this one indicates it's only about 3 years old. Again, information that wasn't in my documents. The serial number was there, but nothing about the age of the equipment or its market appeal. I was starting to suspect that Inspector Williams wasn't who he claimed to be, but I wasn't sure what to do about it. Confronting a DOT inspector, even a suspicious one, could result in serious consequences for my CDL and my business. Inspector, I need to ask you for your badge number and the name of your supervisor. I want to make sure this inspection is properly documented. Williams looked annoyed. Camden, I don't appreciate drivers questioning my authority. I'm conducting a legitimate safety inspection, and your cooperation is required by federal law. He was right about the law. But legitimate DOT inspectors expect questions about documentation and procedures. They're used to dealing with drivers who want to protect themselves legally, and they're usually happy to provide badge numbers, supervisor information, and inspection reports. Williams's defensive reaction was another red flag. But then he did something that convinced me he was definitely not a real DOT inspector. He pulled out a smartphone and took pictures of my cargo, my trailer interior, and my paperwork. Real DOT inspectors use official forms and documentation procedures. They don't take smartphone photos of cargo and documents during inspections. Inspector Williams, I need you to stop taking pictures and provide me with official documentation of this inspection. He ignored me and continued photographing everything, including shots of the equipment serial numbers and my bill of lading details. That's when I decided to call 911. I'm calling the California Highway Patrol to verify your credentials, I told him. If you're a legitimate DOT inspector, they'll be able to confirm it. Williams suddenly became very interested in wrapping up the inspection. That won't be necessary, Camden. Everything looks good here. Make sure you get those tie-downs checked at your next stop. A couple of them are showing wear. He climbed down from my trailer, handed me back my paperwork, and walked quickly toward the front of the truck stop. I closed and locked my trailer doors, then followed him to see where he went. By the time I got to the front of the parking lot, he was gone. No DOT vehicle, no inspection equipment, no sign of where he'd come from or where he'd gone. I called 911 anyway and asked to speak with a CHP dispatcher. When I described the inspection and gave them Inspector Williams' badge number, they told me there was no DOT inspector by that name working in California. The badge number I'd seen didn't match any current or former DOT personnel in their database. The dispatcher took my report seriously and sent a patrol unit to meet me at the truck stop. Officer Martinez arrived about 20 minutes later and took detailed statements about the encounter. He told me that there had been several reports over the past few months of someone impersonating DOT inspectors at truck stops throughout Central California. The pattern is always the same, Officer Martinez explained. Middle-aged white male, official-looking uniform, knows enough about trucking regulations to seem legitimate. He targets owner-operators hauling high-value cargo, conducts fake inspections, and photographs equipment and paperwork. We think he's part of a cargo theft ring that uses the information to plan hijackings or break-ins. Officer Martinez showed me security camera footage from the truck stop. The cameras had captured clear images of the fake inspector, but they also revealed something disturbing. Williams had been in the parking lot for over 2 hours before approaching me, moving between trucks and apparently targeting specific vehicles. The cameras showed him checking license plates and looking at cargo information displayed on trailers before selecting me as his target. Camden, this guy knew you were coming, Officer Martinez said. He wasn't conducting random inspections. He was waiting for your specific truck and cargo. That means someone gave him information about your load, your route, and probably your schedule. The implications were terrifying. Someone in the shipping chain, the shipper, the broker, maybe even someone at the receiving company, had provided information about my load to criminals who were planning to steal it. The fake inspection was reconnaissance, gathering detailed information about the cargo and my security procedures to plan a theft. Officer Martinez advised me to vary my route to Phoenix and avoid stopping anywhere until I reached the delivery location. He also suggested I contact my insurance company and the shipper to report the incident. Most importantly, he warned me that the thieves might try to intercept my truck before I could reach Phoenix. I followed his advice, taking Interstate 5 south instead of my planned route through Bakersfield, and driving straight through to Phoenix without stopping. Delivered the cargo Monday morning without incident. But I was nervous the entire trip, constantly checking my mirrors and staying in contact with dispatch. 2 weeks later, Officer Martinez called me with an update. They had arrested the fake inspector. His real name was David Chen, and he was part of a sophisticated cargo theft operation that had been targeting high-value freight throughout California and Nevada. Chen had been getting inside information from employees at shipping companies, freight brokers, and even some trucking firms. The most disturbing part was how long the operation had been running. Chen had been impersonating DOT inspectors for over 18 months, and the theft ring had successfully stolen more than $3 million worth of cargo using information gathered during fake inspections. They would identify valuable loads, conduct reconnaissance disguised as official inspections, then either hijack the trucks en route or break into trailers at truck stops when drivers were sleeping or eating. Chen had been arrested at another truck stop, attempting to conduct a fake inspection on a truck hauling electronics. This time, the driver was suspicious enough to call 911 immediately, and CHP officers were able to catch Chen in the act. When they searched his vehicle, they found fake DOT uniforms, fraudulent credentials, and detailed information about dozens of high-value loads moving through California. During questioning, Chen revealed that my load had been targeted because someone at the shipping company had provided information about the cargo, the route, and my scheduled stops. That person was never identified, which means there could still be insiders providing information to cargo thieves. The experience taught me that the biggest threats in trucking aren't always the ones you expect. Road accidents, mechanical breakdowns, and bad weather are obvious dangers that we prepare for and plan around. But the human threats, the people who use official credentials, insider information, and professional procedures to gain access to you and your cargo, are often more dangerous because they're harder to identify and defend against. I still work as an owner-operator, but I've changed how I handle inspections and interactions with people claiming to represent government agencies. I verify credentials more carefully, I document everything, and I don't hesitate to call 911 if something doesn't feel right. Most importantly, I've learned that legitimate authority figures welcome questions and verification. It's the fake ones who get defensive when you ask for proof of their identity. The road is dangerous enough without having to worry about criminals disguised as the people who are supposed to protect us. But that's the reality of modern trucking. And every driver needs to be aware that not everyone wearing a badge has your best interests at heart. My name is Edward, and I've been driving long haul for 17 years. In all that time, I've always been obsessive about security. I lock my doors, I park in well-lit areas, I do walk-arounds before I sleep, and I never leave anything valuable visible in my cab. My truck is my home away from home, and treating it like a fortress has kept me safe through hundreds of thousands of miles and countless nights sleeping in truck stops, rest areas, and shipper facilities across the country. What happened to me over the course of 3 weeks on I-77 through Virginia shattered everything I thought I knew about personal security and showed me that sometimes the most terrifying violations can happen right under your nose without you even knowing it. I run a regular route hauling electronics from Charlotte, North Carolina, up to Baltimore, Maryland, and back. It's a good run, consistent freight, reliable customers, and I know every mile of I-77 and I-95 like the back of my hand. The route takes me through some beautiful country in Virginia, and there's a rest area about 60 miles south of Richmond that I've been using for my mandatory 10-hour breaks for over 5 years. It's clean, well-maintained, has decent security lighting, and the Virginia State Police patrol it regularly. I'd never had any problems there, which is why I always planned my driving schedule to hit that rest area for my sleeper berth time. My truck is a 2019 Freightliner Cascadia with a 72-inch sleeper berth that I've customized over the years to make it as comfortable as possible. I've got a memory foam mattress, blackout curtains, a small refrigerator, microwave, TV, and even a security system with motion sensors and door alarms. The sleeper berth is my sanctuary, the one place on the road where I can truly relax and feel safe. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, so subtle that I almost missed it. I'd parked at the I-77 rest area on a Tuesday night in September, done my usual walk-around inspection, checked all my locks, and settled in for my 10-hour break. When I woke up the next morning, I noticed that my thermos of coffee, which I always leave on the small counter next to my bunk, was about half empty. I was sure I'd filled it before going to sleep. It's part of my routine. But I figured I might have been more tired than I realized, and maybe I'd drunk some of it before falling asleep. The second incident was 2 weeks later. Same rest area, same parking spot. This time, when I woke up, I found that my logbook had been moved. I always keep it in the same place, tucked into a pocket on the passenger side of the sleeper berth. But that morning, it was lying on the driver's seat. Again, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I'd been updating my logs and left it there without thinking about it. But the third incident made it clear that something was seriously wrong. I'd parked at the rest area on a Thursday night, and before going to sleep, I'd eaten a sandwich and left half of it wrapped in foil in my small refrigerator. When I woke up Friday morning, the sandwich was gone. But in its place was an empty energy bar wrapper, a brand I'd never bought or eaten. Someone had been in my sleeper berth while I was asleep, had eaten my food, and had left evidence of their own meal behind. I immediately checked my door locks and security system. Everything was still engaged, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had tampered with the electronic locks or bypassed the alarm system. But someone had definitely been in my truck. The question was how, and more importantly, when and why. I called the Virginia State Police from the rest area and reported the incident. Trooper Johnson, who responded, took my statement seriously, but pointed out that without signs of forced entry or actual theft, there wasn't much they could investigate. He suggested that I might be experiencing some kind of sleep disorder or memory issues, which made me angry, but also made me doubt myself. Was it possible that I was doing these things in my sleep and not remembering them? That doubt lasted exactly 1 week, until I decided to set up my own surveillance system. I installed a small, battery-powered security camera in my sleeper berth, positioned so it would record anyone entering the space while I slept. The camera was designed for home security, with night vision capability and motion activation. I hid it behind some personal items where it wouldn't be visible to a casual observer. The following Thursday night, I parked at the same rest area, activated the camera, and went through my normal bedtime routine. I made sure to eat all of my food, secure all of my personal items, and double-check all of my locks before going to sleep. When I woke up Friday morning, I immediately checked the camera. What I saw in that recording will haunt me for the rest of my life. At 2:47 a.m., while I was sound asleep, a figure appeared in the frame. It was a man, thin build, wearing dark clothes and moving with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from practice. He was already inside my sleeper berth when the motion sensor triggered the camera, which meant he'd entered through some method that didn't involve opening doors or windows in my immediate vicinity. The intruder moved around my sleeping area like he knew the layout intimately. He opened my refrigerator, ate some of my food, and then did something that made my skin crawl. He sat down on the small chair next to my bunk and just watched me sleep. For over 20 minutes, this stranger sat 3 feet away from me, observing me while I was completely vulnerable and unconscious. But the most disturbing part was what happened next. The intruder took out what appeared to be a smartphone and began taking pictures. Photos of me sleeping, photos of my personal belongings, photos of documents and paperwork. He seemed particularly interested in my logbooks, my route, information, and my delivery schedules. He photographed everything methodically, like he was documenting my life and work patterns for some specific purpose. Around 3:15 a.m., the intruder quietly left, disappearing from the camera's view the same way he'd appeared, without triggering any of my door alarms or security systems. I was left with 45 minutes of recorded footage showing a complete stranger treating my most private space like it was his own personal research facility. I didn't go back to sleep that night. Instead, I drove straight to the Virginia State Police headquarters in Richmond and demanded to speak with a detective. Detective Sarah Collins reviewed the camera footage with me, and her reaction confirmed that this was far more serious than simple trespassing or theft. "Edward, this person has been doing this for a while," Detective Collins said after watching the recording. "Look how comfortable he is in your space, how well he knows the layout. This isn't opportunistic crime. This is systematic surveillance. He's gathering information about you for some specific purpose." Detective Collins arranged for a forensics team to process my truck for evidence. What they found was even more disturbing than the camera footage. The intruder had been entering my sleeper berth through the roof vent. He'd somehow obtained tools to remove and replace the vent cover from the outside, allowing him to enter and exit without triggering door or window alarms. The forensics team found tool marks on the vent housing and traces of lubricant that had been used to make the removal and replacement process silent. More disturbing still, they found evidence that this had been going on for much longer than I'd realized. Hair and fiber samples that didn't belong to me were found throughout the sleeper berth, indicating multiple intrusions over several months. The intruder had been entering my truck regularly, probably every time I parked at that rest area, which meant he'd been watching me sleep and documenting my life for at least 20 weeks. But the most chilling discovery came when Detective Collins ran the security footage through facial recognition software. The intruder was identified as Robert Hayes, a 34-year-old with a history of breaking and entering convictions, but more importantly, a history of charges related to identity theft and financial fraud. Hayes had been targeting truck drivers, gathering personal and financial information to use in elaborate schemes to steal identities and commit fraud using driver's credentials. When they arrested Hayes 3 days later at his apartment in Richmond, they found what Detective Collins described as a truck driver identity farm. Hayes had detailed information about dozens of drivers, copies of CDLs, social security numbers, banking information, route schedules, and thousands of photographs taken inside sleeper berths while drivers slept. He'd been selling this information to criminal networks that specialized in identity theft, cargo theft, and financial fraud. Hayes had targeted me specifically because I was a regular at that rest area with predictable patterns and valuable cargo information. But I wasn't his only victim. Detective Collins found evidence that Hayes had been systematically targeting drivers who used that rest area regularly, sometimes entering multiple trucks in a single night. The method Hayes used was sophisticated and took advantage of a vulnerability that most drivers never consider. Roof vents on sleeper berths are designed to be removable for maintenance, but they're not typically secured against tampering. Hayes had developed tools and techniques to remove vent covers silently and quickly, enter through the roof opening, and replace the covers when he left. The entire process took less than 2 minutes, and it left no obvious signs of intrusion. Detective Collins told me that Hayes had been operating this scheme for over 2 years and had victimized at least 47 different truck drivers. Some victims never realized they'd been targeted because Hayes was careful not to take anything obvious or make changes that would be immediately noticed. Others, like me, began noticing small discrepancies, but couldn't figure out what was happening. The financial damage Hayes caused was extensive. Using the personal information he'd gathered, he and his associates had opened fraudulent credit accounts, filed false tax returns, and even applied for commercial loans using drivers' identities. Several victims had their CDLs suspended due to violations that Hayes had committed using their information. One driver lost his house when Hayes used his identity to take out a second mortgage. Hayes was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for identity theft, breaking and entering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the damage he'd done to his victims went far beyond financial losses. He'd violated our most private spaces, our homes on the road, the places where we're supposed to feel safe and secure. I still drive the same route, but I never park at that rest area anymore. I've also made significant modifications to my truck security, including reinforced vent covers with tamper-evident seals and additional motion sensors that cover areas my original system missed. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if the evidence seems minor or easily explained. The experience taught me that the threats truckers face aren't always the obvious ones, like highway accidents or cargo theft. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who attack us in our sleep, who violate our personal spaces so subtly that we don't even realize we're being victimized. Hayes turned our need for rest and security into a vulnerability, using our own routines and patterns against us. I share this story not to make other drivers paranoid about sleeping in their trucks, but to emphasize the importance of varying your routines and being aware that personal security requires constant vigilance. The road is full of predators who are more sophisticated, more patient, and more invasive than most people realize. Your sleeper berth should be your sanctuary, but it's only as secure as you make it. And sometimes that means preparing for threats you never imagined possible. The violation of having someone watch you sleep, photograph your most private moments, and steal your identity while you're unconscious is something that stays with you. Every night when I close my eyes in my sleeper berth, I remember that for months, I wasn't sleeping alone. And that knowledge has changed how I see the road, how I see security, and how I see the space I call home when I'm thousands of miles away from the people I love. My name is Derek, and I've been a company driver for Midwest Transport for 11 years. I follow rules, I maintain my logs accurately, I keep my equipment in good condition, and I've never had a serious violation or accident in over 800,000 miles of driving. I'm what you'd call a by-the-book driver, the kind of guy who gets nervous when his logbook is even 5 minutes off, who always has his paperwork organized and ready for inspection, and who would rather sit in traffic for an hour than risk a speeding ticket. That attention to detail and rule-following mentality has served me well throughout my career. But what happened to me at a way station on I-10 in West Texas taught me that sometimes following procedures and trusting the system can lead you into situations that defy all logic and reason. I was hauling a load of automotive parts from Detroit to El Paso, running about 2 days ahead of schedule because traffic had been lighter than expected, and I'd made good time through the Midwest. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early November, and I was crossing Texas on Interstate 10, about 60 miles east of El Paso, when I saw the signs for the Hudspeth County Way Station. The electronic sign indicated that the station was open and commercial vehicles were required to enter for inspection. Way stations are routine parts of trucking life. Every driver knows the procedure. You pull into the queue, wait your turn, drive across the scales, and either get waved through or pulled aside for additional inspection. Most of the time, if your paperwork is in order and your truck is legal, you're through the station in 10 minutes or less. I'd been through hundreds of way stations over the years, and this one looked completely normal as I approached. The queue leading to the scales had about 15 trucks ahead of me, which wasn't unusual for a busy way station on a major interstate. I pulled in behind a refrigerated trailer and settled in to wait. The truck ahead of me was driven by a guy in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and flannel shirt. Typical long-haul driver. Behind me, a flatbed hauling construction equipment took position in line. Everything seemed routine and normal, but after sitting in line for about 20 minutes without any movement, I started to get impatient. I could see the scales ahead, and there appeared to be trucks crossing them regularly, but our line wasn't advancing at all. I figured maybe there was a breakdown or some kind of delay with the inspection equipment. So I decided to walk up toward the scales to see what was happening. What I found confused me. The scales were operating normally. Trucks were crossing them and either being waved through or directed to parking areas for additional inspection. But somehow, none of the movement I was seeing translated to progress in our queue. The same trucks that had been ahead of me when I arrived were still in the same positions, in the same order, despite the apparent activity at the scales. I walked back to my truck and asked the driver of the reefer unit ahead of me how long he'd been waiting. About 3 hours, he said, which seemed impossible. I'd only been in line for 20 minutes, and he'd been directly ahead of me the entire time. But when I looked at my dashboard clock, it showed 4:15 p.m. I was certain I'd entered the way station at 3:45 p.m. But somehow, an hour and a half had passed without my noticing. The flatbed driver behind me was a younger guy, maybe early 30s, and when I asked him about the wait, he said he'd been in line since Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning? I said. That's impossible. Today is Wednesday afternoon. No, man. Today is Thursday, he replied. I've been sitting here for over 30 hours, and every time I try to leave the queue, one of those DOT officers comes over and tells me I have to wait for processing. They say if I leave without being inspected, they'll suspend my CDL. I was starting to feel disoriented. According to my logbook, my electronic logging device, and my own memory, I'd entered this way station on Wednesday afternoon after making good time across Texas. But the other drivers were telling me it was Thursday, and they'd been waiting for days to be processed through a routine inspection. I decided to walk toward the way station office to find out what was causing the delay. The building looked normal from the outside, a standard DOT facility with glass doors, American and Texas flags, and the usual signs about commercial vehicle inspections and regulations. But when I got closer, I noticed that the windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside, and there was no movement or activity visible through the doors. A DOT officer approached me as I was walking toward the building. He was wearing a standard uniform with all the right patches and badges. but something about him seemed off. His uniform looked old-fashioned somehow, like it was from the 1980s or 1990s rather than current issue. His hair was perfectly styled in a way that seemed outdated, and his skin had an unhealthy grayish pallor. "Driver, you need to return to your vehicle and wait in the queue," he said. "All commercial vehicles must be processed through the inspection sequence before leaving the facility." "Officer, how long is this delay going to last?" I asked. "I've got a delivery appointment in El Paso tomorrow morning, and some of the other drivers are saying they've been waiting for days. Processing times vary depending on the complexity of each inspection," he replied. "Your patience is appreciated, and leaving the queue before processing is completed will result in serious violations of federal transportation regulations." There was something mechanical about the way he spoke, like he was reciting a script rather than having a normal conversation. When I tried to ask more specific questions about the delay or the inspection process, he just repeated variations of the same responses about staying in queue and waiting for processing. I walked back toward my truck, but decided to talk to more of the drivers who were waiting. What I heard from them made my blood run cold. The driver of a tanker truck, about 10 vehicles ahead of me, claimed he'd been in the queue for over a week. A car hauler driver said he'd been waiting for 2 weeks and was running out of food and water. Several drivers mentioned that they'd tried to call their dispatchers or families, but their cell phones had no signal inside the way station area. I checked my own phone and found that they were right. No signal, no data, no way to communicate with the outside world. My electronic logging device, which normally maintained constant connection to my company's fleet management system, was showing no connection errors. It was like the way station existed in some kind of dead zone that cut off all electronic communication. But the most disturbing conversations were with drivers who'd been waiting the longest. An elderly driver in a beat-up Peterbilt claimed he'd been in line for 3 months. His truck was covered with dust and grime, his clothes were dirty and worn, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been eating regularly. When I asked him how he'd survived for 3 months, he pointed to a small building near the rear of the facility. "They got a little store back there," he said. "Sells food, water, basic supplies. Prices are high, but what choice do we got? Can't leave till they process us, and they keep saying it's going to be soon, just a little longer." I walked to the building he'd indicated and found what appeared to be a small convenience store staffed by the same kind of DOT officers who were managing the queue. The shelves were stocked with non-perishable food, bottled water, and basic truck maintenance supplies. But the prices were astronomical. A bottle of water cost $15, a can of soup was $25, and a gallon of diesel fuel was over $10. When I asked the officer behind the counter about the prices, he said, "Prices reflect the remote location and specialized service provided to commercial drivers during extended processing periods." Again, the same mechanical response style, like he was reading from a script. I was starting to panic. According to my ELD, I'd been at the way station for over 6 hours, but it felt like I'd just arrived. Other drivers were claiming they'd been there for days, weeks, or even months, and none of them could leave without risking their CDLs. The facility was apparently self-contained, with its own store selling overpriced supplies to trapped drivers who had no other options. As the sun started to set, I noticed something that made the situation even more surreal. The trucks that were supposedly being processed through the scales weren't actually leaving the facility. I could see them crossing the scales, getting waved through by DOT officers, and driving toward what appeared to be an exit. But when I walked to the back of the facility to see where they went, I found another queue of trucks waiting in a different area. The processed trucks were just being moved to another part of the weigh station, not released back onto the interstate. It was like a shell game, with trucks being moved from queue to queue to create the illusion of progress, while never actually allowing anyone to leave. That's when I noticed the condition of some of the trucks that had supposedly been processed. Many of them showed signs of long-term neglect. Flat tires, dead batteries, rust, and decay that suggested they'd been sitting in the facility for months or years. Some of the drivers sitting in these trucks looked emaciated, almost skeletal, like they were slowly wasting away while waiting for a processing that would never come. I realized that I was looking at a trap, a bureaucratic nightmare that used official procedures and the threat of regulatory violations to keep drivers imprisoned indefinitely. The weigh station was designed to look legitimate, to follow all the proper forms and protocols, but it was actually a system for capturing trucks and drivers, keeping them trapped while slowly extracting money through overpriced supplies and services. The horror wasn't supernatural or mysterious. It was purely human, a system of exploitation disguised as regulatory compliance. Someone had created a fake weigh station that looked official enough to fool drivers into entering voluntarily, then used their respect for rules and fear of violations to keep them trapped. As darkness fell, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of spending the night in my truck like the other drivers, I decided to walk the perimeter of the facility to look for an actual exit. What I found was a gap in the fence at the rear of the property, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The fence had been cut, probably by other drivers who'd figured out the truth about the facility. I went back to my truck, started it up, and instead of waiting in the queue, I drove toward the gap in the fence. Several DOT officers ran toward my truck, shouting about violations and suspended licenses. But I kept driving. As I pushed through the gap and onto a dirt road that led back to I-10, I could see the officers in my mirrors, but they didn't pursue me beyond the fence line. When I reached the interstate, my phone immediately reconnected, my ELD resumed normal operation, and I was able to contact my dispatcher. According to him, I'd been out of communication for less than 2 hours, not the 6 hours my ELD showed or the much longer periods the other drivers had claimed to experience. I reported the incident to the real Texas Department of Transportation, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and the FBI. What they told me was that the facility I'd encountered wasn't an official weigh station point. The real Hudspeth County weigh station had been closed for renovations for over 2 months. Someone had created an elaborate fake facility designed to trap commercial vehicles and exploit drivers. The investigation revealed that the fake weigh station was part of a sophisticated fraud operation that had been capturing trucks and drivers for over a year. The officers were actors hired to play roles. The facility was designed to mimic official procedures, and the entire operation was funded by money extracted from trapped drivers through overpriced supplies and services. Dozens of trucks and drivers were rescued from the facility when law enforcement raided it. Some drivers had been trapped for months, spending thousands of dollars on overpriced supplies, while their companies and families assumed they'd simply disappeared. Several drivers had died from malnutrition and medical neglect while waiting for a processing that was never intended to be completed. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the physical facility. By using official-looking uniforms, proper procedures, and the threat of regulatory violations, the criminals had convinced experienced professional drivers to voluntarily imprison themselves and pay for the privilege. I still get weigh station inspections regularly, but now I verify the location and status of every facility before entering. I've learned that criminals can be incredibly sophisticated in their methods, using our own respect for rules and regulations against us. Sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones that look exactly like legitimate procedures, staffed by people who appear to represent the authority we're trained to respect and obey. The road is dangerous enough without having to worry about fake government facilities designed to exploit our compliance with regulations. But that's the reality of modern trucking. Even the systems designed to protect us can be corrupted and turned into weapons against us. My name is Billy, and I've been driving trucks for 19 years. I'm what you might call a social driver. I enjoy the camaraderie of the CB radio. I like running with other trucks when possible. And some of my best memories on the road have been made during impromptu convoys with drivers I'd never met before, but felt like lifelong friends by the end of the trip. There's something special about rolling down the highway with a group of professional drivers, all watching out for each other, sharing information about road conditions and speed traps, and just enjoying the fellowship that comes from doing the same job under the same stars. What happened to me on I-15 through the Nevada desert changed my perspective on convoy culture forever, and taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand exactly what draws us together. I was running a load of furniture from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, standard freight that I'd hauled dozens of times over the years. I'd left LA on a Sunday evening, planning to drive through the night to avoid the desert heat and make good time across Nevada while traffic was light. It was late October, perfect weather for desert driving, with clear skies and temperatures in the 70s even after midnight. About 2 hours into Nevada, somewhere around Barstow, I started hearing chatter on Channel 19 about a convoy forming up for the run across the desert. The lead driver was using the handle Desert Fox, and he was organizing what sounded like a fun group of drivers who wanted to run together for safety and companionship through the long, lonely stretch of Interstate 15 between Barstow and Las Vegas. Any drivers looking to join up for a desert crossing convoy? We're forming up at the Flying J at Barstow, Desert Fox announced. We got 5 trucks so far, room for more. Plan is to run steady at 65, watch each other's backs, and make this crossing a little less lonesome. Come on over to Channel 17 if you're interested. I was making good time and feeling sociable, so I switched to Channel 17 and joined the conversation. Desert Fox welcomed me to the group and gave me directions to fall in as the 6th truck in the convoy. The other drivers seemed friendly and professional, a mix of owner-operators and company drivers hauling various types of freight. We had a reefer unit, a flatbed, a car hauler, a tanker, and my furniture van, plus Desert Fox, who was pulling what he said was electronics. We formed up at the Flying J truck stop, and I got my first look at the other trucks in the convoy. They were all well-maintained rigs with experienced drivers who knew how to handle themselves on the road. Desert Fox was driving a sharp-looking black Kenworth with custom chrome and lighting that marked him as someone who took pride in his equipment. The other trucks were equally impressive. This was clearly a group of professional drivers who knew what they were doing. We rolled out of Barstow around midnight, settling into a comfortable formation with Desert Fox in the lead, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour and keeping good spacing between trucks. The CB chatter was exactly what I expected from a group of experienced drivers. Reports on road conditions, jokes, stories about past trips, and the general camaraderie that makes long-haul driving tolerable. But as we got deeper into the Nevada desert, the conversation started to change. It began subtly, with Desert Fox making comments about the sacred nature of desert highways and how driving through the darkness connected us to something larger than ourselves. At first, it seemed like the kind of philosophical rambling that drivers sometimes get into during long night runs, but it gradually became more focused and specific. "Brothers," Desert Fox said over the radio, We're not just hauling freight tonight. We're participating in something ancient, something that goes back to the first people who traveled these desert paths. The highway is more than asphalt and paint lines. It's a river of energy, a conduit for forces that most people never recognize. The other drivers in the convoy began responding with enthusiasm that seemed out of proportion to what Desert Fox was saying. They started talking about how the desert highway was calling to them, how they could feel the power of the road beneath their wheels, and how lucky they were to be part of something greater than ordinary trucking. I found the conversation weird, but not alarming. Truckers can be a philosophical bunch, especially during long night runs through isolated areas. I'd heard stranger discussions on the CB over the years, and as long as everyone was driving safely, I didn't see any harm in letting the other guys wax poetic about the mystical nature of highway travel. But around 2 a.m., about an hour past Baker, Desert Fox announced that we were going to take the sacred route instead of staying on Dabri 15. He directed the convoy to take an exit that led to what appeared to be a secondary highway heading north into the desert. When I questioned the route change, he assured me that it was a legitimate truck route that would save time and fuel while giving us a more authentic desert experience. The exit led to a 2-lane highway that was in good condition but completely unmarked. There were no signs indicating where the road led, no mile markers, and no other traffic. My GPS showed the road on its maps, but listed it as a local road, with no specific designation. Desert Fox assured us that it was a legitimate route that many experienced desert drivers used to avoid the congestion around Las Vegas. As we drove deeper into the desert on this unmarked road, the CB conversation became increasingly strange. The drivers started talking about how they could feel the power more strongly now that we were off the main highway. They discussed concepts like energy vortexes and ley lines, and how certain desert locations were spiritually charged in ways that enhanced the trucking experience. Desert Fox began leading the group in what he called road mantras, repetitive phrases that we were supposed to chant over the CB while driving. The highway provides, the highway protects, the highway calls us home, was one example. We are the chosen ones. We are the desert guardians. We serve the eternal road, was another. At first, I didn't participate, but the peer pressure from the other drivers was intense, and I found myself joining in just to maintain group harmony. After about an hour on the unmarked road, Desert Fox announced that we were approaching our sacred destination, a place where truckers had been gathering for decades to participate in ceremonies that honored the spiritual aspects of highway travel. He described it as a hidden truck stop that catered specifically to drivers who understood the deeper meaning of their profession. What we found was a large, well-lit facility in the middle of nowhere, with parking for dozens of trucks and what appeared to be a restaurant and supply store. But something about the place felt wrong from the moment we pulled in. The lighting was too bright, too white, creating harsh shadows that made everything look artificial. The buildings were clean and well-maintained, but they had an institutional quality that reminded me more of a prison or military facility than a truck stop. As we parked our trucks, I noticed that there were already about 20 other trucks in the lot, all perfectly aligned in rows with mathematical precision. The drivers of these trucks were standing outside their vehicles, and as our convoy approached, they began moving toward us with synchronized steps, like they were following some kind of choreographed routine. Desert Fox gathered our convoy drivers together and announced that we were about to participate in a welcoming ceremony that would initiate us into the brotherhood of the eternal highway. The other drivers from the parked trucks formed a circle around us, and I got my first good look at their faces in the harsh artificial lighting. They all had the same expression, blank, emotionless stares with pupils that were dilated far beyond what the bright lighting should have caused. Their skin had an unhealthy grayish pallor, and they moved with the mechanical precision of people who were heavily sedated or under some kind of chemical influence. When they spoke, which was rarely, their voices had a flat, monotonous quality that made them sound like they were reading from scripts. Desert Fox began leading what he called a highway communion ceremony, which involved all of the drivers standing in formation around our trucks while chanting the same mantras we'd been repeating on the CB. But now, the chanting was accompanied by physical movements, specific gestures and positions that Desert Fox demonstrated and expected everyone to copy exactly. I was starting to feel genuinely frightened. This wasn't the friendly convoy camaraderie I'd signed up for. This was some kind of cult activity involving people who were clearly not in their right minds. When I tried to excuse myself and return to my truck, several of the blank-faced drivers blocked my path and insisted that leaving before the ceremony was complete would be disrespectful to the highway spirits. The ceremony continued for over an hour, with increasingly bizarre rituals involving the trucks themselves. Desert Fox had everyone place their hands on their vehicles while chanting, then directed us to start our engines in sequence to create what he called a mechanical harmony. The sound of 25 truck engines running in perfect synchronization in the middle of the desert was genuinely eerie, especially combined with the continued chanting of drivers who were clearly not acting rationally. But the moment that made me realize I was in serious danger came when Desert Fox announced that the final part of the ceremony involved offering our cargo to the highway spirits. He wanted everyone to open their trailers and symbolically present their freight as tribute to whatever forces he believed controlled the desert roads. That's when I noticed that many of the trucks that had been parked at the facility when we arrived had their trailer doors standing open, revealing that they were completely empty. These drivers had apparently gone through the same ceremony and had actually surrendered their cargo, leaving them with empty trailers and no freight to deliver. I realized that I was looking at a sophisticated cargo theft operation disguised as a mystical trucking brotherhood. Desert Fox and his associates were using the social dynamics of convoy culture and the isolation of desert highways to lure drivers to this remote location, where they were drugged, manipulated, and convinced to surrender their cargo voluntarily as part of a fake spiritual ceremony. When Desert Fox directed me to open my trailer, I pretended to comply, but instead quietly started my engine and began backing away from the group. Several of the blank-faced drivers tried to stop me, but they moved too slowly, like people who were heavily sedated. I managed to get my truck turned around and headed back toward the unmarked road we'd used to reach the facility. As I drove away, I could see in my mirrors that the other drivers from my original convoy were going through the motions of the cargo surrender ceremony. They were opening their trailers, removing their freight, and stacking it in organized piles, while continuing to chant the mantras that Desert Fox had taught them. The drugs, or whatever substances they'd been given, had clearly compromised their judgment to the point where they were willingly participating in their own victimization. I drove back toward Durs 15 as fast as safely possible, constantly checking my mirrors to see if anyone was following me. When I reached the Yiyan interstate, I immediately called 911 and reported what I'd witnessed. The Nevada State Police took my report seriously and dispatched units to investigate the location I described. What they found when they raided the facility was a sophisticated operation that had been victimizing truck drivers for over 2 years. Desert Fox's real name was Vincent Carlucci, and he was the leader of a criminal organization that specialized in cargo theft using psychological manipulation and chemical coercion. The truck stop was a fake facility designed to look legitimate while serving as a base for processing stolen freight. The investigation revealed that Carlucci and his associates would monitor CB radio traffic to identify potential targets, then infiltrate convoy formations using friendly, experienced drivers as bait. They would lure convoys to the remote facility using various pretexts, sometimes spiritual ceremonies, sometimes promises of better routes or fuel stops, sometimes fake emergency situations that required group assistance. Once drivers arrived at the facility, they were given food and drinks laced with drugs that made them suggestible and compliant. The elaborate ceremonies were designed to create a sense of group commitment and peer pressure that made it difficult for individuals to resist participating. The combination of chemical influence and social manipulation was apparently very effective. Most drivers who were brought to the facility did surrender their cargo voluntarily. The rescue operation found 12 drivers at the facility in various stages of drugged compliance. Some had been there for days, going through repeated ceremonies while their judgment was compromised by ongoing chemical administration. Several had to be hospitalized for drug withdrawal and malnutrition. The stolen cargo recovered from the facility was valued at over $2 million. Carlucci was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for cargo theft, kidnapping, and drug-related charges. But the experience taught me that the social aspects of trucking culture, the camaraderie, the mutual support, the willingness to help other drivers, can be exploited by people who understand how to manipulate group dynamics and social pressure. I still participate in convoys when the circumstances feel right. But I'm much more cautious about who I trust on the CB radio and where I'm willing to follow other drivers. The desert highway can be a lonely place, and the human need for companionship and community can make us vulnerable to people who know exactly how to exploit those needs. The most disturbing part of the whole experience wasn't the theft or even the drugs. It was realizing how easily normal, intelligent, experienced drivers could be manipulated into participating in their own victimization. The combination of isolation, social pressure, and chemical influence created a situation where people made decisions they would never make under normal circumstances. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand exactly what we're looking for: friendship, community, a sense of belonging to something larger than ourselves, and use those legitimate needs against us. The road is full of people who know how to speak our language, share our culture, and gain our trust, but who have intentions that are anything but friendly. My name is Hank, and I've been driving trucks for 27 years. In that time, I've logged over 3 million miles, and I've got what you might call a photographic memory for routes. I can tell you every truck stop, every way station, every rest area, and every good place to eat between any 2 points in the continental United States. I know which Flying J has the cleanest showers, which TA has the best coffee, and which independent stops treat drivers with respect versus the ones that see us as walking wallets. My memory for roads and facilities has served me well throughout my career, helping me plan efficient routes and avoid problems before they develop. What happened to me at the junction of Interstate 70 and Interstate 25 in Colorado challenged everything I thought I knew about the geography of America's highway system, and showed me that sometimes the most familiar places can become the most terrifying. I was running a load of computer equipment from Denver to Kansas City, a route I'd driven probably 200 times over the years. It's a straightforward run east on Interstate 70 through Colorado and Kansas, about 8 hours of driving time with proper brakes. I know every mile of that highway, every truck stop, every landmark, and every place where you might run into construction delays or weather problems. I'd left Denver around 4 a.m. on a Thursday morning in early December, planning to make Kansas City by early afternoon and be back home in Colorado by the weekend. The weather was clear but cold, with temperatures in the teens and a forecast calling for possible snow later in the day. perfect conditions for making good time across the plains before any winter weather could develop. About 2 hours east of Denver, just before the junction where I-25 splits off from I-70, I saw a truck stop that I'd never noticed before. It was positioned right at the intersection, with large signs advertising fuel, food, and showers. The signs looked like standard truck stop signage, and the facility appeared to be a full-service operation with multiple fuel islands, a large parking area, and a substantial building that housed the restaurant and convenience store. What struck me as odd was that I'd driven past this exact location hundreds of times over the years, and I was certain there had never been a truck stop here before. The junction of I-70 and I-25 is a major interchange that I knew intimately, and the presence of a large commercial facility should have been something I remembered. But there it was, brightly lit in the pre-dawn darkness, looking like it had been there for decades. My fuel tanks were about half full, but I decided to stop and check out this new facility. I was curious about when it had been built and how I'd managed to miss its construction. New truck stops don't appear overnight, and major facilities require months of construction that would have been visible to drivers passing through the area regularly. I pulled into the fuel island and began filling my tanks. The pumps were modern and worked normally, accepting my fuel card and dispensing diesel at competitive prices. But as I looked around the facility while fueling, I started noticing details that didn't make sense. The building architecture looked like it was from the 1970s or 1980s, with design elements that modern truck stops had abandoned decades ago. The signage was professionally made but used fonts and color schemes that seemed outdated. When I went inside to pay for fuel and grab some coffee, the interior of the truck stop reinforced my impression that something was wrong with the timeline. The restaurant area had booth seating with vinyl upholstery in colors that hadn't been popular since the Reagan administration. The convenience store section carried products I recognized, but many of them were in packaging designs that companies had stopped using years ago. But the most unsettling aspect was the staff. The cashier was a middle-aged woman who greeted me politely and processed my fuel payment efficiently. But she was wearing a uniform style that looked like it belonged in a different era. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested the 1980s, and she spoke with the kind of formal politeness that had been common in customer service decades ago, but had been replaced by more casual interactions in modern retail environments. I asked her when the truck stop had opened, and she looked at me with confusion. "We've been here since 1987, she said. "This is a well-established facility that serves drivers on Interstate 70 and Interstate 25. Are you new to this route?" I explained that I'd been driving this route for years and had never seen the truck stop before, which seemed to puzzle her even more. "That's impossible," she said. "We're one of the busiest truck stops in Colorado. Drivers stop here every day. You must be thinking of a different location." I went to the restaurant area and ordered breakfast, hoping to talk with other drivers who might be able to explain what I was missing. There were about a dozen truckers in the restaurant, and they all seemed normal at first glance, typical long-haul drivers having coffee and meals during their breaks. But as I listened to their conversations, I began noticing that they were discussing things that didn't match current reality. One driver was complaining about new regulations that had been implemented last year that I knew had actually been introduced in 1995. Another was discussing CB radio protocols and equipment models that had been discontinued in the early 1990s. A third driver mentioned that he was hauling a load for a company that I knew had gone out of business in 1989. I approached one of the drivers and asked him what year it was. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said, "It's 1987, of course. December 17th, 1987. Are you feeling okay, driver?" According to my logbook, my cell phone, and my own memory, it was December 17th. But of 2023, not 1987. I was 36 years displaced from the reality that everyone else in the truck stop seemed to be experiencing. When I tried to show the other drivers my smartphone to prove that we were in the 21st century, they looked at the device with the kind of confusion that people in 1987 would have shown when confronted with technology that wouldn't be invented for another decade. The driver I was talking to examined my phone carefully and said, "This is some kind of fancy calculator or something? I've never seen anything like it. What company makes this equipment?" I tried to explain that it was a smartphone with internet connectivity, GPS navigation, and video capabilities. But my description only increased his confusion. To him, I was describing science fiction technology that didn't exist in his reality. When I mentioned the internet, GPS satellites, and digital communication networks, he listened politely, but clearly thought I was either joking or suffering from some kind of mental health episode. I excused myself and went to the restroom to try to process what was happening. In the mirror, I looked exactly like myself. A 47-year-old truck driver in 2023. But when I came back out, I noticed that my truck looked different. It was still my 2021 Peterbilt, but parked among the other trucks in the lot, it looked absurdly modern and out of place. The other trucks were all models from the 1980s, conventional Kenworths, Peterbilts, and Freightliners, with design features that hadn't been used in decades. I decided to check my electronic logging device to see what it was recording. The ELD showed that I was at the correct GPS coordinates for the I-70/I-25 junction in Colorado, and it was displaying the correct date and time for 2023. But when I looked out the window at the truck stop, I was clearly in a facility that existed in 1987. The most disturbing realization came when I tried to leave. I started my truck, which ran normally, and began driving toward the exit. But as I approached the highway on-ramps, I couldn't find the modern I-70 and I-25 that I knew should be there. Instead, I found highway configurations that matched what those interstates had looked like in the 1980s, before major reconstruction projects that I remembered from the 1990s and 2000s. I was trapped in a version of Colorado's highway system that was 36 years out of date, driving a modern truck that didn't belong in that time period, carrying cargo to companies that might not exist yet in this displaced reality. My GPS system was showing my current location accurately, but the roads it was mapping didn't match the physical roads I could see around me. I drove back into the truck stop parking lot and tried to think through what was happening logically. Either I was experiencing some kind of massive hallucination or psychological breakdown, or I had somehow become displaced in time while maintaining my physical connection to 2023 through my truck and its electronic systems. I decided to test the boundaries of this displacement by trying to use my cell phone to call my dispatcher. The phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given that cellular networks in 1987 were primitive and wouldn't have been compatible with modern smartphone technology. But when I tried to use the truck stop's payphone to call my company, the number wasn't recognized. The dispatcher told me that no such trucking company existed, and that the phone number I was calling from was associated with a truck stop that had been demolished 15 years earlier. That's when I realized the truth about my situation. I wasn't displaced in time. I was in a truck stop that existed outside of normal time, a place that had somehow been preserved from 1987 and continued operating in isolation from the changes that had occurred in the outside world. The facility was like a pocket of the past that had been maintained in perfect condition, complete with staff, customers, and operational systems from 3.5 decades ago. I spent several hours in the truck stop, talking with drivers and staff who existed in this temporal bubble. They were all real people with real memories and experiences. But their reality had been frozen in 1987, while the rest of the world moved forward. Some of them seemed to have vague awareness that something was wrong. They would mention feeling like they'd been at the truck stop for a very long time, or having difficulty remembering details about their lives before arriving there. One driver told me that he'd stopped for fuel 3 days earlier, but somehow hadn't been able to leave. Every time he tried to drive back onto the interstate, he would find himself returning to the truck stop without any clear memory of how he'd gotten back there. He'd been eating meals, sleeping in his cab, and going through the motions of normal truck stop activities. But he couldn't actually depart from the facility. As evening approached, I became increasingly desperate to escape this temporal trap. I was supposed to deliver my load in Kansas City, and my company would be expecting me to check in regularly. If I remained trapped in 1987, I would effectively disappear from my normal timeline, leaving my family and employer to wonder what had happened to me. I decided to try a different approach to leaving. Instead of driving toward the highway entrances, I drove directly across the truck stop property toward what I hoped would be empty land beyond the facility boundaries. As I reached the edge of the truck stop's physical footprint, the world around me seemed to shimmer and distort, like looking through heat waves rising from hot pavement. When the distortion cleared, I found myself on modern Interstate 70, driving east toward Kansas in normal 2023 reality. My GPS showed that I was exactly where I should be, according to my planned route, and my cell phone immediately reconnected to the cellular network. When I looked in my mirrors, for the truck stop I'd just left, there was nothing there. Just empty land at the highway junction where I was certain I'd seen a fully operational facility. I pulled over at the next real truck stop and called my dispatcher to report my location. According to my electronic logging device, I had been driving normally for the entire morning and was making good time toward Kansas City. There was no record of any extended stop or delay, no indication that I'd spent several hours in a truck stop that existed in 1987. When I researched the history of the I-70/I-25 junction later, I found that there had indeed been a truck stop at that location that opened in 1987. It had operated successfully for about 5 years before closing due to financial problems in 1992. The facility had been demolished in 1995 to make room for highway expansion projects, and the land had remained empty ever since. I've driven past that junction dozens of times since that December morning, and I've never seen any trace of the truck stop again. But sometimes, in the early morning hours when the light is dim and my mind is tired from long hours of driving, I think I catch a glimpse of those bright lights in my peripheral vision. And every time I pass that spot, I can't help but wonder how many other drivers have found themselves trapped in places that exist outside of normal time, serving customers and staff who don't realize that the world has moved on without them. The experience taught me that the highway system holds more mysteries than most people realize, and that sometimes the most familiar places can become gateways to realities that operate by completely different rules than the ones we take for granted. My name is Tyler, and I'm part of the generation of truckers who grew up with technology. While the old-timers learned to navigate by road signs and paper maps, I've always relied on GPS, electronic logging devices, and digital communication systems to make my job easier and safer. I'm comfortable with technology in a way that drivers from previous decades sometimes aren't. And I've always believed that modern equipment makes trucking more predictable and secure. What happened to me on Highway 50 in Nevada taught me that sometimes our dependence on technology can be turned against us, and that the very systems we trust to keep us safe can become the tools of our destruction. I was hauling computer components from San Francisco to Denver, running a route that took me across Nevada on what's famously known as the loneliest road in America. Highway 50 cuts straight across the Nevada desert for hundreds of miles, with virtually no towns, no services, and no cell phone coverage. It's a challenging route that requires careful planning and self-sufficiency. But it's also one of the most direct paths between California and Colorado. About 3 hours east of Carson City, somewhere in the middle of nowhere between Fallon and Austin, my truck started developing what seemed like transmission problems. The engine was running fine, but I was losing power intermittently, and the transmission was making grinding noises that suggested something serious was about to fail. My dashboard warning lights weren't showing any specific problems, but I could feel that something was definitely wrong with the drivetrain. Highway 50 in that area is absolutely desolate. No truck stops, no service stations, no cell phone towers, nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. The nearest town was over 60 miles away, and I was carrying a load worth over $200,000 that I couldn't afford to abandon or leave unguarded. I needed help, but I was in one of the most isolated places in the continental United States. I tried my cell phone first, but as expected, there was no signal. GPS showed my exact location, but that didn't help if I couldn't communicate with anyone. My electronic logging device was still recording my position and status, but it couldn't transmit data without cellular connectivity. All of my modern communication technology was useless in the middle of the Nevada desert. That's when I remembered my CB radio. I'd installed it mainly for entertainment and information sharing with other drivers. But CB Channel 9 is designated as the emergency frequency, monitored by volunteers and emergency services in remote areas. I switched to Channel 9 and began broadcasting a distress call. Emergency, emergency. This is eastbound truck broken down on Highway 50, approximately mile marker 183. I have transmission failure and need assistance. Anyone monitoring Channel 9, please respond. I repeated this call several times over the course of about 10 minutes with no response. The static was heavy, which wasn't unusual in mountainous desert terrain. But I was starting to worry that I was too remote for anyone to hear my transmissions. Just as I was considering my limited options for dealing with a breakdown in the middle of nowhere, a clear voice came through the static. Eastbound truck at mile marker 183. This is Desert Rescue Monitoring Channel 9. We copy your emergency transmission and are prepared to provide assistance. What is the nature of your mechanical problem? The voice was professional and calm, exactly what you'd want to hear during an emergency situation. The operator identified himself as Mike from Desert Rescue, a volunteer emergency assistance service that monitored CB frequencies in remote areas of Nevada. He explained that they specialized in helping stranded motorists and truckers in areas where traditional emergency services were too distant to provide timely assistance. Mike asked detailed questions about my truck's symptoms, my cargo, and my current situation. I described the transmission problems, the grinding noises, and the intermittent power loss I was experiencing. He listened carefully and then provided what seemed like knowledgeable diagnostic advice. Tyler, based on what you're describing, it sounds like you're dealing with a torque converter problem that's causing your transmission to slip and overheat. The good news is that this is something that can often be temporarily repaired with the right procedures, allowing you to limp to a proper service facility. The fact that he knew my name surprised me, since I hadn't mentioned it during my emergency calls. When I asked how he knew to call me Tyler, He explained that CB monitoring services often had access to vehicle registration databases that allowed them to identify drivers and provide more personalized assistance. Mike began walking me through a series of diagnostic procedures, telling me which gauges to check, which controls to test, and how to evaluate the severity of the transmission problem. His instructions were detailed and technically accurate, showing a level of mechanical knowledge that impressed me. He seemed to understand my truck systems better than I did. "Tyler, I need you to look at your transmission temperature gauge and tell me what reading you're getting. Also, check your transmission fluid level using the dipstick located near the back of the engine compartment." I followed his instructions, reporting the gauge readings and fluid levels back to him over the CB. Mike analyzed the information and concluded that the problem was likely a failing torque converter that was causing the transmission fluid to overheat and lose viscosity. "The good news is that we can probably get you mobile again with a temporary fix," Mike said. "I'm going to guide you through a procedure that involves adjusting your transmission's electronic controls to bypass the failing torque converter and operate in a limited function mode." What happened next was the most technically sophisticated CB radio assistance I'd ever experienced. Mike provided step-by-step instructions for accessing my truck's electronic control systems through the dashboard interface, navigating to diagnostic menus that I didn't even know existed, and making adjustments to transmission parameters that seemed far beyond what most emergency assistance operators would know. "Tyler, use the steering wheel controls to access your vehicle's diagnostic menu. Press and hold the cruise control set button while turning your key to the on position. This will bring up the electronic control interface." I followed his instructions, and sure enough, a diagnostic menu appeared on my dashboard display that I'd never seen before. Mike guided me through multiple screens and sub-menus, having me adjust settings for transmission shift points, torque converter lockup parameters, and electronic throttle response curves. "Now, I need you to navigate to the transmission override menu and change the torque converter setting from automatic to manual bypass mode. This will prevent the failing torque converter from engaging and allow the transmission to operate in direct drive only." The procedures Mike was describing were incredibly specific and technical, requiring knowledge of my truck's electronic systems that seemed beyond what most people would possess. But his instructions were clear and accurate, and as I made the adjustments he recommended, I could feel the transmission responding differently. After about 30 minutes of guided diagnostics and electronic adjustments, Mike had me start the truck and test the repairs. The grinding noise was gone, and the power loss seemed to be resolved. The transmission was operating in a limited mode that reduced performance but allowed normal driving. "Tyler, the temporary fix should get you to the next major service facility, but you'll need to maintain lower speeds and avoid aggressive acceleration. Your transmission is now operating in emergency mode, which bypasses the damaged components but puts additional stress on other parts of the system." I was grateful for the assistance and impressed by Mike's technical knowledge. But I was also puzzled by some aspects of the situation. His familiarity with my truck's systems seemed unusually comprehensive, and some of the procedures he'd guided me through were more sophisticated than what I'd expect from a volunteer emergency service operator. "Mike, I have to ask, how do you know so much about the electronic systems in my specific truck model? These diagnostic procedures seem pretty advanced for general emergency assistance." There was a long pause before Mike responded, and when he did, his voice had a slightly different quality. Less conversational, more mechanical. "Tyler, our emergency assistance service maintains comprehensive technical databases for all commercial vehicle systems. We are trained to provide detailed diagnostic support for any mechanical problems you might encounter during your journey. Something about his response bothered me. The language seemed oddly formal, and he referred to our service and "we are trained" in a way that sounded scripted rather than natural. But more concerning was the growing realization that Mike seemed to know things about my situation that I hadn't told him. "Tyler, you should begin driving eastbound now. Maintain a steady speed of exactly 55 miles per hour and do not deviate from Highway 50. Your next checkpoint will be the town of Austin, approximately 47 miles from your current location." I hadn't mentioned anything about Austin or discussed my planned route with Mike. Highway 50 was the obvious route to continue on, but his specific reference to Austin as a checkpoint and his instruction to maintain exactly 55 miles per hour seemed oddly prescriptive for general assistance advice. As I started driving, Mike continued providing guidance over the CB, but his instructions became increasingly specific and controlling. He told me exactly when to check my mirrors, when to adjust my speed, and when to report my position. It felt less like emergency assistance and more like being remotely operated by someone who was monitoring my every move. "Tyler, in approximately 2 miles, you will see a white sedan parked on the shoulder of the road. Do not stop to offer assistance. Continue past the vehicle and report your position when you have cleared it." Sure enough, exactly 2 miles later, I saw a white sedan parked on the shoulder just as Mike had predicted. The car appeared to be empty, but something about Mike's advanced knowledge of its location made me extremely uncomfortable. How could he know about a specific vehicle on the road ahead of me unless he was watching my route in real time? "Mike, how did you know about that sedan? Are you tracking my location somehow?" "Tyler, our emergency assistance service maintains comprehensive monitoring of Highway 50 traffic patterns to provide optimal support for stranded motorists. Continue driving eastbound and report your position at regular intervals." The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was very wrong with this situation. Mike's technical knowledge was too comprehensive. His advanced knowledge of road conditions was too specific, and his level of control over my movements was too detailed for a legitimate emergency assistance service. I started to suspect that Mike wasn't providing emergency assistance at all. He was guiding me into some kind of trap. The transmission problems that had stranded me might not have been mechanical failures, but rather remote interference with my truck's electronic systems. The repairs Mike had guided me through might not have fixed anything, but rather allowed whoever was controlling the situation to resume directing my movements. The most chilling realization came when I recognized my own voice in Mike's instructions. Occasionally, when he was telling me what to do or where to go, I could hear inflections and speech patterns that sounded exactly like my own voice, played back through electronic processing. It was like listening to myself give instructions to myself, but processed through technology that made it sound like a different person. "Tyler, you are approaching the final checkpoint. Reduce speed to 35 miles per hour and prepare to exit the highway at the abandoned gas station approximately 1 mile ahead. Your assistance team is waiting to complete your repairs." I could see the abandoned gas station he was referring to, but I also realized that this was where the trap would be sprung. Instead of following Mike's instructions, I floored the accelerator and drove past the exit at maximum speed. In my mirrors, I could see vehicles pulling out of the abandoned station and beginning to pursue me. As I drove away from the trap, Mike's voice over the CB became increasingly agitated and distorted. The calm, professional tone was replaced by electronic screeching and what sounded like my own voice played back at different speeds and pitches. It was clear that Mike had never been a human operator. but rather some kind of sophisticated AI system that had been manipulating me using synthesized speech based on recordings of my own voice. The pursuit continued for about 20 miles before the following vehicles gave up and turned back. When I finally reached Austin, Nevada, and got back into cell phone range, I called 911 and reported the incident. The Nevada Highway Patrol told me that there had been several reports of truckers being lured off Highway 50 by fake CB emergency assistants, and that several drivers had disappeared entirely after reporting mechanical problems in that area. The investigation revealed that criminals were using advanced technology to create fake breakdowns in commercial vehicles, then providing emergency assistance that guided drivers to remote locations where they could be robbed, their cargo stolen, or worse. The AI system I'd encountered was sophisticated enough to synthesize realistic human speech, provide accurate technical information, and even predict road conditions by accessing traffic monitoring systems. What saved me was recognizing my own voice in the AI's speech patterns and realizing that the emergency assistance was too knowledgeable and too controlling to be legitimate. The technology that I'd always trusted to keep me safe, CB radio, GPS navigation, electronic vehicle systems, had all been compromised and turned into tools for predators who understood how to exploit our dependence on digital communication. I still carry a CB radio, but I'm much more cautious about trusting voices that claim to offer help in remote areas. The highway is full of predators who understand our technology better than we do, and who can use our own systems against us in ways that most drivers never imagined possible. Sometimes the most dangerous assistance is the kind that knows exactly what you need to hear. My name is Vincent, and I've been an independent trucker for 12 years. I take whatever loads pay the best, which means I'm not picky about cargo, routes, or schedules. If the rate is right and the load is legal, I'll haul it. That philosophy has served me well financially, allowing me to own my truck outright and build a solid reputation with brokers who know I'll take the loads that other drivers won't touch. The weird schedules, the difficult pickup locations, the cargo that requires special handling. But what happened to me at a distribution center outside Detroit taught me that sometimes there's a reason other drivers won't take certain loads, and that some freight comes with costs that no amount of money can justify. The load offer came through my broker on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. It was a rush shipment requiring immediate pickup from an industrial facility in the Detroit area, with delivery to a research facility in upstate New York. The pay was exceptional, nearly double what I'd normally expect for a load of that distance and weight. The cargo was listed as medical specimens with special handling requirements, which explained the premium rate, but also meant additional paperwork and regulatory compliance. I'd hauled medical freight before: pharmaceuticals, laboratory equipment, blood products for hospitals. And while it required more attention to detail than general freight, it was usually straightforward work with good pay. The broker assured me that all permits and documentation would be provided at pickup, and that the receiving facility was expecting the cargo for time-sensitive research. The pickup location was a 24-hour distribution center in an industrial area about 30 miles outside Detroit. I'd never been to this particular facility before, but the address and company name checked out when I researched them online. The company, Biologistics Solutions, appeared to be a legitimate medical supply and research support operation with proper licensing and regulatory compliance. I arrived at the facility around 10 p.m., which was later than I'd normally prefer for cargo pickup. But the rushed nature of the shipment required accommodation of unusual schedules. The distribution center was located in a complex of similar industrial buildings, all modern construction with proper security lighting and access controls. Nothing about the exterior appearance suggested anything unusual or suspicious. The loading dock area was busy despite the late hour, with several trucks being loaded simultaneously. But as I backed up to my assigned dock, I started noticing details that made me uncomfortable. The other trucks being loaded were all refrigerated units, which wasn't unusual for medical freight. But the drivers and dock workers were all wearing full hazmat suits. Complete protective gear, including respirators, gloves, and shoe covers. When I approached the dock supervisor to present my paperwork, he was also wearing hazmat protection. Through his respirator, he explained that the cargo required special handling procedures and that I would need to don protective equipment before the loading process could begin. He provided me with a hazmat suit similar to what the other workers were wearing, along with detailed instructions for proper donning and doffing procedures. I asked what type of medical specimens required such extensive protection, and the supervisor explained that they were dealing with Category B biological substances that required containment protocols to prevent exposure. He assured me that the cargo was properly contained and posed no risk to drivers as long as basic safety procedures were followed. The hazmat suit was uncomfortable and restrictive, making it difficult to move normally or communicate clearly with the loading crew. But I'd dealt with hazmat requirements before, and the supervisor's explanation seemed consistent with legitimate medical transport protocols. The additional safety measures actually made me feel more confident that I was dealing with a professional operation that took regulatory compliance seriously. The loading process took about 2 hours, which was longer than normal, but not unreasonable given the special handling requirements. The cargo consisted of 12 large containers, each about the size of a washing machine, secured in climate-controlled housing units that were loaded into my refrigerated trailer. The containers were labeled with biohazard symbols and identification numbers, but no specific description of contents beyond biological research materials. But during the loading process, I started noticing things that didn't match my previous experience with medical freight. The containers made sounds, not mechanical humming from refrigeration equipment, but organic sounds like breathing, shifting, or movement from within the units themselves. When I asked the dock workers about the sounds, they assured me it was normal for certain types of biological specimens to require life support systems that created audible mechanical processes. More disturbing was the behavior of the loading crew. Despite wearing full protective equipment, they handled the containers with extreme caution, as if they were afraid of the cargo they were loading. Several times, I saw workers jump back from containers or signal for additional assistance when moving units that didn't appear to be particularly heavy or unstable. The dock supervisor provided me with extensive documentation for the shipment, including multiple permits, handling instructions, and emergency contact information. But when I reviewed the paperwork, I noticed that much of it was heavily redacted, with key information about the specific nature of the cargo blocked out with black marker. The receiving facility was listed as Blackwater Research Institute, with an address in rural New York, but no specific contact person or detailed delivery instructions. Before departure, the supervisor gave me additional safety briefings that seemed excessive for routine medical transport. I was instructed to avoid opening the trailer for any reason during transit, to maintain specific temperature ranges, and to contact emergency services immediately if I experienced any equipment failures or containment breaches. He also provided me with a sealed emergency kit that I was told to use only if instructed by the monitoring team that would be tracking my progress. The monitoring aspect was new to me. The supervisor explained that the cargo required real-time tracking and that I would be in constant communication with a support team throughout the journey. They installed additional communication equipment in my cab, including a direct radio link to what they called the Transport Coordination Center. As I prepared to leave the facility, I noticed that several of the dock workers had removed their hazmat suits and were standing near the loading dock smoking cigarettes. But in the bright security lighting, I could see that they didn't look normal. Their skin had an unhealthy grayish color, and several of them appeared to have surgical scars or modifications, extra appendages, enlarged skulls, or limb configurations that didn't match normal human anatomy. When I mentioned this to the supervisor, he explained that the facility employed workers with various medical conditions and disabilities, and that the specialized nature of their work sometimes required surgical modifications to handle hazardous materials safely. He assured me that all employees were properly trained and medically cleared for their duties. I started driving toward New York, but within the first hour, the direct radio communication began featuring conversations that made me increasingly nervous. The monitoring team was discussing my cargo using terminology that sounded more like veterinary care than medical research. They referenced feeding schedules, behavioral modifications, and specimen viability in ways that suggested my cargo was alive and required ongoing care during transport. Around 2 a.m., about 4 hours into the trip, the monitoring team instructed me to pull over at a specific rest area for what they called a cargo wellness check. A team of technicians met me there, all wearing the same hazmat protection I'd seen at the loading facility. They opened my trailer and spent about 30 minutes checking the containers, adjusting controls, and apparently providing some kind of care or maintenance to whatever was inside the units. I wasn't allowed to observe this process directly, but I could hear sounds from my trailer that definitely didn't sound mechanical. There were what appeared to be vocalizations, not human speech, but complex sounds that suggested intelligence and communication. At one point, I heard what sounded like a child crying, but distorted in a way that made it seem not quite human. When the technicians finished their work, the lead supervisor approached me with additional instructions. He explained that the cargo was performing well and that delivery was on schedule, but that I needed to be prepared for additional wellness checks during the remainder of the journey. More concerning, he mentioned that some of the specimens were approaching maturation and might require behavioral management if they became restless. I asked directly what kind of medical specimens required behavioral management, and the supervisor's answer chilled me to the bone. He said that the research facility was working on human enhancement projects that involved genetic modifications and biological integration studies. The cargo I was hauling wasn't medical supplies or research materials. It was living subjects that had been genetically modified for experimental purposes. The realization that I was transporting what appeared to be human subjects who had been subjected to genetic experimentation made me physically sick. This wasn't legitimate medical research. This was human trafficking disguised as scientific transport, involving people who had been surgically and genetically modified against their will. I told the supervisor that I wanted to terminate the transport immediately and return the cargo to the original facility. But he informed me that the shipment was now under federal oversight and that abandoning the cargo would result in serious legal consequences. He showed me documentation that appeared to be from government agencies, suggesting that this was an official research project with national security implications. But I'd noticed that the federal documentation had the same kind of heavy redaction and suspicious formatting that I'd seen in the original shipping paperwork. More importantly, the supervisor and technicians were displaying the same grayish skin color and surgical modifications that I'd observed in the loading dock workers in Detroit. During the next wellness check, scheduled for a truck stop in Pennsylvania, I decided to investigate what was actually in my trailer. While the technicians were focused on their maintenance procedures, I managed to get close enough to see inside one of the containers through a small observation window. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The container held what had once been a human being, but had been surgically and genetically modified beyond recognition. Multiple arms, enlarged skull, skin that appeared to be partially synthetic, and eyes that showed intelligence and awareness despite the horrific physical alterations. The subject was conscious and alert, tracking my movement with those modified eyes, and I could see that it was trying to communicate despite whatever procedures had been done to its vocal system. I realized that I was looking at the result of illegal human experimentation, and that everyone involved in this operation, the loading crew, the supervisors, the monitoring technicians, were either willing participants in this horror or were themselves victims who had been modified to serve the operation. I made the decision that probably saved my life and sanity. During the next scheduled rest stop, I disconnected the monitoring equipment, left the truck and trailer in the parking lot, and called 911 from a payphone. I reported that I was transporting victims of human experimentation and provided detailed information about the cargo, the route, and the people involved in the operation. When federal authorities investigated the truck stop, they found the trailer empty except for the refrigeration equipment. The containers that had held the modified subjects were gone, and there was no evidence of the cargo I described. The monitoring team had somehow retrieved their subjects and disappeared without leaving any trace of their operation. The investigation revealed that Biologistics Solutions was a front company with no legitimate business operations. The Detroit facility was found empty when authorities raided it, with no evidence of the loading dock operation I described. The Blackwater Research Institute in New York didn't exist, and the address I'd been given led to an empty field. But the authorities did find evidence that confirmed the existence of illegal human experimentation operations. Financial records, communications intercepts, and testimony from other witnesses indicated that there was a network of facilities conducting unauthorized genetic modification experiments on human subjects, often using legitimate medical transport as cover for moving victims between locations. I was never paid for that load, and I never found out what happened to the subjects I'd transported. But the experience taught me that there are freight operations that exist in the shadows of legitimate commerce, using the infrastructure of legal trucking to support activities that most people wouldn't believe possible. I still take loads that other drivers won't touch, but I'm much more careful about verifying the legitimacy of shippers and cargo. The road is full of people who use the anonymity and mobility of trucking to facilitate crimes that go far beyond simple theft or fraud. Sometimes the cargo that pays the best comes with costs that no amount of money can justify, and some loads are better left to drivers who don't have functioning consciences. My name is Frank, and after 40 years of driving trucks across this great country, I'm finally hanging up my keys. Tomorrow is my last day as a professional driver, and I thought I'd spend tonight going through my logbooks, my route records, and all the documentation I've accumulated over 4 decades on the road. It's been a hell of a career. 3.2 million miles logged, deliveries to all 48 continental states, and memories that span from the CB radio era to GPS navigation to electronic logging devices. I've seen this industry change in ways I never could have imagined when I first climbed behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler in 1983. But as I sit here in my sleeper berth, reviewing the mathematical record of my entire professional life, I've discovered something that has shattered my understanding of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the past 4 decades. I started with my very first logbook, the one from my rookie year when everything was still exciting and new. Back then, we kept paper logs, handwritten entries documenting every mile, every fuel stop, every rest period. The regulations were simpler, the trucks were less sophisticated, but the fundamental job was the same. Move freight safely and efficiently from point A to point B. My first entry was dated March 15, 1983, beginning what I thought would be a straightforward career in transportation. As I worked my way through the decades of documentation, I began plotting my routes on maps, trying to visualize the millions of miles I'd covered and the thousands of trips I'd completed. I used a GPS mapping program on my laptop to trace the routes, entering the starting points and destinations from my logbooks to see the complete picture of my career geography. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. According to my logbooks, I'd made trips between hundreds of different cities. New York to Los Angeles, Miami to Seattle, Denver to Boston. Every possible combination of origins and destinations across the continental United States. But when I plotted these routes on the GPS mapping system, something impossible emerged from the data. Every single route I'd driven in 40 years, regardless of the starting city or destination, regardless of the cargo or the customer, regardless of the season or the year, had followed the exact same 1-mile stretch of highway. The GPS coordinates for every single mile I'd logged over 4 decades corresponded to a single mile of I-70 in central Kansas. Mile marker 247 to mile marker 248. I thought there had to be an error in my data entry or the mapping software, so I double-checked everything. I re-entered coordinates manually, cross-referenced my logbooks with fuel receipts and delivery confirmations, and verified the GPS data multiple times. But the result was always the same. 3.2 million miles of driving, all contained within a single mile of highway in the middle of Kansas. The implications were impossible to accept. I had clear memories of driving through mountain passes in Colorado, crossing bridges in Florida, navigating city traffic in Chicago, and delivering loads to customers in every major metropolitan area in the country. I could remember specific truck stops, particular stretches of highway, conversations with other drivers, and thousands of details that proved I'd traveled extensively throughout the United States. But according to the GPS data, I'd never left that 1 mile of I-70. Every trip I thought I'd taken, every destination I thought I'd reached, every mile I thought I'd driven had actually occurred within that single stretch of Kansas highway. I decided to examine my odometer records to see if they would provide any clarification. My current truck showed 3.2 million miles on the odometer, which matched exactly with my logbook totals. But if I'd only been driving the same 1-mile stretch repeatedly, the odometer should show a maximum of a few thousand miles, not millions. That's when I realized that the odometer was somehow recording distance differently than actual geographical movement. I'd been driving that same mile over and over again, millions of times. But each repetition was being recorded as if it were a unique mile of highway. The truck's systems were documenting imaginary progress while I remained trapped in an endless loop of the same stretch of road. The most disturbing discovery came when I examined the photographs I'd taken over the years. I'd always been good about documenting my trips. Photos of interesting scenery, unusual loads, truck stops, and the various places I'd visited during my career. I had thousands of photos spanning 4 decades, showing me in front of landmarks, scenic vistas, and distinctive locations from coast to coast. But when I looked at the photos more carefully, I realized they all showed the same background landscape, the flat, unchanging terrain of central Kansas. The photos I thought showed me in front of the Golden Gate Bridge actually showed me standing in front of empty Kansas prairie. The pictures I remembered taking at the Grand Canyon showed the same featureless horizon. Every single photograph, regardless of where I thought I'd taken it, showed the identical Kansas landscape with minor variations in lighting and weather. Even more unsettling was the realization that the photos showed me aging normally over the 40-year span. But the landscape never changed. I could see myself getting older, my hair graying, my face developing lines and wrinkles. But the background in every photo was exactly the same mile of Kansas highway. I pulled out photo albums showing my family over the years. My wife Sarah, my children growing up, grandchildren being born. But as I examined these family photos more closely, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The same people appeared in photos throughout the entire 40-year span, but they were aging in cycles. Sarah would appear as a young woman, then gradually age to middle age, then elderly, then somehow return to being young again. My children would grow from babies to adults, then somehow restart the cycle as babies again. It was like watching the same people live the same lives over and over, aging and dying and being reborn in an endless repetition that spanned decades. The family I thought I'd been supporting and returning home to after every trip was actually cycling through the same experiences repeatedly, trapped in their own version of the loop that had imprisoned me on that mile of highway. The final piece of evidence came when I checked my employment records and financial documentation. According to my tax returns and pay stubs, I'd worked for dozens of different trucking companies over the years, hauling freight for hundreds of different customers. But when I traced the addresses and contact information for these companies, they all led back to the same location. A trucking terminal located at mile marker 247.5 on Interstate 70 in Kansas. Every company I thought I'd worked for, every customer I thought I'd delivered to, every dispatcher I thought I'd communicated with, was actually part of the same operation located at the midpoint of my 1-mile prison. The entire trucking industry that I thought I'd been part of was actually a single facility managing the endless repetition of the same delivery cycle. I realized that my entire career, everything I thought I'd accomplished, every relationship I thought I'd built, every mile I thought I'd driven, had been an illusion created to maintain my participation in an endless loop of the same day's work. I'd been driving the same route, delivering the same load, talking to the same people, and living the same experiences over and over again for 40 years. But the most horrifying realization was understanding why this had happened. I remembered my very first day of driving, March 15th, 1983, when I'd been nervous about handling an 18-wheeler on my own for the first time. I'd been driving eastbound on I-70 through Kansas, approaching mile marker 248, when I'd seen another truck approaching from the opposite direction, drifting into my lane. The collision was inevitable. I'd had maybe 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to think about my new career ending before it had really begun. 2 seconds to wish I could have that mile back to drive more carefully. And somehow, that wish had been granted in the most terrible way possible. I'd been given that mile back over and over again, for 40 years. Every time I completed the mile successfully, avoiding the collision that would have killed me on my first day, the universe reset and allowed me to drive it again. My wish for more time, for another chance, for the opportunity to prove myself as a professional driver, had been granted in a form that trapped me in an eternal repetition of my final moments of life. The truck that had been approaching me in 1983, the one that would have ended my career and my life, was my own truck. Me, 40 years older, still trying to complete that same mile, still approaching the same collision from the opposite direction. I'd been driving toward myself for 4 decades, trapped in a loop where my success in avoiding death only set up the conditions for the same near-death experience to repeat endlessly. I understand now that everyone I'd encountered during these 40 years, my family, my co-workers, other drivers, customers, everyone who had populated my illusory career, were all part of the same temporal prison. We were all trapped in the moments before our deaths, given the chance to live our final experiences over and over, creating the appearance of full lives while actually existing in the infinite repetition of single moments. The realization that I'd been dead for 40 years, That everything I'd experienced since that March day in 1983 had been the universe's way of allowing me to avoid accepting my death was both liberating and terrifying. I'd lived a full career, raised a family, and accumulated a lifetime of memories and experiences. But none of it had been real in any sense that mattered to the world beyond that mile of Kansas highway. As I write this final entry in my logbook, I can see the approaching headlights of the truck that will end this cycle. After 40 years of avoiding that collision, I've finally accepted that my time as a professional driver ended on the day it began. The career I thought I'd lived was actually the dream of a dying man, granted the gift of experiencing a full life in the infinite moments before the impact. But here's what I need you to understand, everyone who hears this story. The highway is more than just asphalt and painted lines. It's a place where time and space and reality can bend in ways that most people never experience. Every mile you drive, every turn you take, every decision you make behind the wheel has the potential to trap you in moments that repeat forever. Pay attention to the signs that something isn't right. If you start noticing that the same mile markers keep appearing, if your fuel gauge never changes, if the same conversations happen over and over, if the people in your life seem to be aging in cycles, you might be caught in your own version of what happened to me. Don't let the highway claim you the way it claimed me. Stay alert, stay aware, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous mile is the one you're driving right now. Because that mile might be the last one you ever really drive, and everything after it might just be the dream of a driver who couldn't accept that his journey had come to an end. The lights are getting closer now, and I can see my own face behind the windshield of the approaching truck. After 40 years, I'm finally ready to complete that last mile and accept whatever comes next. But you still have time to make sure your miles are real, your destinations are actual, and your journey doesn't become an endless repetition of moments that never truly pass. Drive safe out there, and remember, sometimes the most important thing isn't reaching your destination, but making sure you're actually traveling toward it instead of just dreaming that you are. The highway is waiting, and it's more patient than you could ever imagine. That's it. Verified Fears family. 11 stories from America's highways that should make you think twice about every late-night drive, every lonely stretch of road, and every time you felt completely alone with only the darkness for company. These truckers trusted me with their most terrifying experiences, and I've shared them with you because the truth is, these roads belong to all of us. But here's what I need you to do. I need you to help me collect more of these stories. If you're a trucker, if you know a trucker, if you've ever experienced something on the highway that you couldn't explain, I want to hear from you. The comment section below isn't just for reactions. It's for sharing your own encounters with the inexplicable things that lurk along our nation's roadways. Because here's the reality. These 11 stories represent just a tiny fraction of what's really happening out there. For every driver who was brave enough to share their experience, there are dozens more who are carrying these memories in silence, afraid that no one will believe them, afraid that speaking out will cost them their careers or their credibility. But silence protects the predators, the anomalies, the things that shouldn't exist but do. When we share these stories, when we document these experiences, when we create a community of people who aren't afraid to acknowledge that there are things in this world that can't be easily explained, that's when we start to take back some of the power from whatever forces are out there feeding on our fear and isolation. So hit me up in the comments, send me emails, reach out through social media. Tell me about the phantom voices on your CB radio, the hitchhikers who know too much, the truck stops that shouldn't exist, the cargo that moves on its own. Tell me about the times you felt watched, followed, or trapped on highways that suddenly don't lead where they're supposed to go. And if you're not a trucker, but this video has changed how you see those 18-wheelers thundering past your car at 3 a.m., I want you to remember something. Those drivers are out there every night, keeping our economy moving, our shelves stocked, our world connected. They deserve our respect, our support, and our acknowledgement that they face dangers most of us will never encounter. The next time you're on a dark highway and you see those running lights approaching in the distance, remember that there's a human being behind that wheel who might have stories that would keep you awake for weeks. They're not just moving freight. They're navigating a world where the normal rules don't always apply, where the familiar can become terrifying, and where the next mile might lead somewhere that doesn't exist on any map. Subscribe to Verified Fears if you haven't already, because we're building something here. A community of people who refuse to pretend that the world is safer, simpler, or more predictable than it actually is. Ring that notification bell. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And remember, the highway is calling, and it's more patient than you could ever imagine. Drive safe out there, keep your eyes open, and never forget that sometimes the most important mile is the one you're driving right now. Until next time, this has been Verified Fears, reminding you that the road goes on forever. But sometimes, so do the things that travel it with you.